Welcome back to the Drowsy Historian. Take a moment before we begin to settle yourself. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Find a posture that feels comfortable. Let your shoulders fall away from your ears. Soften your jaw. Let the day go. Tonight, we are going to travel slowly. Very slowly, across centuries, across mountains, across an empire so vast that its furthest borders never met. We are going to follow the long, quiet collapse of Rome, from the cool marble of its highest noon, through the slow and patient erosion of its frontiers, and finally to the quiet evening, hundreds of years later, when a young emperor laid down his crown and walked, almost unnoticed, into history. There is no urgency to any of this. Rome itself was never in a hurry. It rose slowly, it ruled slowly, and it fell in the end more slowly still. So you do not need to remember the names. You do not need to follow the maps. You can let the words drift in and out the way the surf slides up onto a long, dark beach. You can fall asleep at any point. The story will keep going, just as the empire did, with or without anyone watching. Set the volume so it is barely above a whisper. Let the breath at the back of my voice be the loudest thing in the room. And when you are ready, close your eyes. We are going to begin with a single, quiet evening in Rome, almost 2,000 years ago. It is the year 150 by the reckoning of a calendar that has not yet been invented. The emperor is a man named Antoninus Pius. He is in his 60s. He is not a soldier. He has never personally led an army into battle. He has never set foot in most of the territory he rules. And yet, from the city where he sleeps tonight, his name is engraved on milestones from the misted hills of northern Britain to the dry edge of the Sahara, from the cold rivers of Germany to the date palms beyond Damascus. There is, at this moment, no living human being who rules more land than he does, and there will not be another for centuries. But Rome, the city itself, is a small place. By modern standards, you could walk across it in less than an hour. Its houses are made of brick. Its streets are narrow. Its great public buildings are the color of warm honey in the late afternoon, and the color of pale bone at dawn. There is, everywhere, the smell of wood smoke and bread, and the particular dry mineral scent of Roman concrete after a summer rain. Tonight, in this quiet year, in the middle of a long settled century, the empire is at peace, or as close to peace as an empire is ever permitted to come. The frontiers are guarded, the roads are open, the grain ships are arriving at the harbor of Ostia, deep with cargo from Egypt, and the great Haria, the warehouses that sit just south of the city, are full. There has not been a famine in living memory. There has not been a serious civil war for almost 100 years. A child born tonight, in the cold corner of an apartment block above a wine shop, will likely grow up speaking Latin, will likely never leave the city, and will likely live and die under the same calm afternoon sky that the emperor is watching now from his garden. This is what we now call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It was not, of course, a true peace. There were always wars on the edges. There were always uprisings in some distant province. There was, for almost everyone, the quiet violence of slavery, of taxation, of empire. But measured against the centuries that came before it, and measured especially against the centuries that came after it, this long afternoon of empire was something the world had never seen, and would not see again for a very long time. It is here, in this slow and golden hour, that our story begins, because every great fall begins, in the end, at the very top. To understand what Rome is about to lose, you have to first understand what Rome has become. By this evening, in the year 150, Rome rules nearly the entire world that it knows. The Mediterranean Sea, which the Romans simply call Mare Nostrum, our sea, is enclosed on every side by Roman provinces. The waters that lap at the harbor of Carthage, on the African coast, lap at the same shore that lap at Antioch in Syria, at Alexandria in Egypt, at Massilia in Gaul, at Tarraco in Spain, and at the long sandy beaches of Italy itself. From every direction you can sail for weeks, and never leave Roman water. In the north, the empire reaches almost to the cold edge of the known world. It crosses the Channel, rises through the green and rainy hills of Britain, and ends at a long, low stone wall, built by the previous emperor Hadrian, to mark the border between civilization, as Rome understood it, and the painted, untamed lands beyond. That wall still stands tonight, watched by cold men in damp wool cloaks, looking out into a fog they cannot see through. In the east, the empire ends at the Euphrates, the slow, ancient river that flows down from the mountains of Armenia toward the warm Gulf below Persia. Beyond that river is the Parthian Empire, the only foreign power that Rome takes seriously. The two empires have been at war, or at the edge of war, or quietly preparing for war, for almost 2 centuries. They have never quite finished one another, and they will not, in the end. They will simply outlive one another, by inches, until both are gone. In the south, the empire ends in the desert. The province of Africa, which today we call Tunisia, is the great breadbasket of the city. Egypt, further east, is the other. Together they feed Rome. Together, every year their grain ships sail north across the Mediterranean, low in the water, bound for the harbor at Ostia and the warehouses beyond. Without them, the city could not exist. The emperor himself does not own Egypt as a province in the ordinary sense. He owns it as a private estate. It is too important to entrust to anyone else. In the west, the empire ends at the Atlantic, Spain, Portugal, the long western coast of Gaul. Beyond that, as far as anyone knows, there is only ocean. And in the center of all of this, the spider, sitting calm at the center of an enormous web of stone and water and trade, is the city of Rome itself. About 1 million people live there, by some estimates, possibly more. It is, at this moment, the largest city that has ever existed anywhere on Earth, and it will hold that title for over 1,000 years. If you walked through Rome on this particular evening, and I want you to imagine that you are doing exactly that, very slowly, with no purpose and nowhere to be, what would you actually see? You would see, first, an enormous crowd of people, Roman citizens, freedmen, slaves, merchants, soldiers on leave, children, beggars, vendors, priests. They speak Latin, but not only Latin. You would hear Greek, which is the language of the educated, and the language of trade. You would hear Aramaic, in the eastern corners of the markets. You would hear Punic, the old Carthaginian tongue, still spoken in pockets 2 centuries after the fall of Carthage. You would hear Celtic dialects from soldiers home from the northern frontier. You would hear the soft, lilting Egyptian Greek of grain merchants from Alexandria. The city is, in the truest sense, a meeting place of every people Rome has ever conquered, and every people Rome has ever traded with. It is the most cosmopolitan city the world has ever produced, and it knows it. You would see, in the public squares, an extraordinary amount of marble. Some of it white, some of it pale gold, some of it deep red, some of it veined with green. The Romans have, by this point, perfected the art of moving stone over enormous distances. They have quarried Egyptian granite, shipped it across the Mediterranean, dragged it on log rollers from the harbor up to the Forum, and lifted it into place using cranes and counterweights. There are columns standing in Rome tonight that were carved out of cliff faces 3,000 miles away. There are obelisks taken whole from the temples of pharaohs who lived 1,000 years before Romulus. You would see fountains everywhere. Water is the genius of Rome. 11 aqueducts feed the city, some of them coming from springs 40, 50, 60 miles outside the walls. Together they deliver, every single day, more fresh water per person than most modern cities. The fountains run constantly. The public baths are full, the latrines flush. The drains carry it all away to the Tiber, which itself flows on, slow and brown, through the heart of the city and out to the sea. You would see temples, hundreds of them, to Jupiter, to Mars, to Venus, to Vesta, to a dozen older Roman gods, and to dozens more from every conquered land. There is a temple to Isis, brought from Egypt. There are sanctuaries of Mithras, the soldier god, brought from Persia. There are Jewish synagogues, perfectly legal, perfectly public, in several quarters of the city. And there are, though almost no one in the city of Rome has noticed them yet, a few small communities of a strange new sect, recently arrived from the eastern provinces, who worship a Jewish carpenter, who was executed under a Roman governor, about 120 years ago. No one in the imperial palace tonight thinks about them at all. In 2 centuries they will rule the empire. You would see soldiers, but not many. Rome itself is technically off-limits to active legions. The emperor is guarded by the Praetorian Guard, a special force of about 10,000 men. But the real Roman army is almost entirely on the frontiers, hundreds and hundreds of miles away, in cold camps along the Rhine and the Danube and the Euphrates. The city is, by the standards of any other capital in any other empire of any other era, almost shockingly demilitarized. You can walk for an entire day in Rome and never see an armed man. And finally, if you walked far enough, and if your feet took you up the long slope of the Palatine Hill, you would see the imperial palace. It is not yet the sprawling complex it will eventually become. But it is already enormous. Marble courtyards, long colonnades, gardens that drop in terraces down toward the forum below, slaves moving silently through the corridors with lamps. And somewhere inside, in a quiet room with the windows open to the cooling night, the Emperor Antoninus Pius is finishing his evening meal and beginning to think about going to bed. This is the empire we are about to lose. Not all at once. The fall of Rome is not, contrary to what schoolchildren are sometimes told, a single event. It is not a date that can be circled on a calendar. It is not a single battle, or a single emperor, or a single barbarian king. It is a process. A long, slow, often almost invisible process. It will take, depending on how you measure it, somewhere between 300 and 1,000 years. Many of the people living through it will not even know that it is happening. In some places, the empire will collapse violently. In others, it will simply fade. The tax collectors will stop coming. The soldiers will go home. The Latin will give way over the course of a few generations to a new dialect. And one day, hundreds of years later, someone will look around and realize that Rome, as a thing in the world, no longer exists. Not because it was destroyed, but because it was forgotten. That is the story we are going to follow tonight, the slow forgetting of Rome. We are going to begin in this golden hour with this calm emperor in this peaceful city, and we are going to walk forward century by century, through the slow erosion of the frontiers, the long crisis of the 3rd century, the great division of the empire into east and west, the arrival of the Goths, the Huns, the Vandals, the slow shrinking of imperial authority, the famous and yet curiously quiet day in 476 when the last Western emperor surrendered his throne, and on, much further on into the long centuries during which the eastern half of the empire, what we now call Byzantium, continued alone to call itself Rome. But all of that is far ahead of us. Tonight here at the beginning the night is calm, the wind is soft, the city is full, the grain ships are coming. Let us begin. The emperor we left in his garden, finishing his evening meal, was the fourth of what later historians would come to call the 5 good emperors. It is a strange title when you think about it. 5 good emperors, as though the others were not. As though the Roman world had been rated, like an inn, by the people who passed through it. But the title comes, in part, from a Roman senator named Cassius Dio, writing a few generations later, looking back on this calm century the way a man, in the thin grey light of a winter morning, sometimes looks back on a long, warm summer afternoon. He looked back on this century, and he saw something that he understood, even then, was almost gone. 5 emperors. 84 years of peace, more or less. The longest stretch of competent, settled rule that the Roman Empire would ever know. Their names, in order, were Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. We will spend a little time with each of them tonight. You do not need to remember which is which. You do not need to keep them straight. They are, in many ways, variations on a single theme. The theme of empire at rest. Empire as a thing that, for a moment, simply is. Empire that does not, every few months, have to be defended from itself. Let us begin with the first of them. Nerva came to the throne late, and not by his choosing. He was, in the year 96, an old man already in his 60s. He had been a senator for most of his life. He was a lawyer by training, a poet in his quieter hours, well-connected, soft-spoken, and entirely unmilitary. He had never led a legion. He had never wanted to. He had spent decades in the back rows of the Senate House, watching emperors come and go, surviving by making no enemies, and offering no opinions that anyone could later remember. The emperor before him, a man named Domitian, had been murdered, stabbed to death in his own bedroom, by men in his own household. The conspirators had not, in their planning, given much thought to what would happen next. They needed a successor. They needed someone the Senate would accept, the army would tolerate, and no one would feel the urgent need to assassinate within the first month. They settled on Nerva because he was old, harmless, and unlikely to live long enough to become a problem. He was, in fact, only emperor for 16 months. He did very little in that time. He restored some confiscated property. He stopped some treason trials. He freed some prisoners who had been held without charge. The army did not love him, and at one point the Praetorian Guard surrounded his palace and demanded the heads of Domitian's killers. Nerva had no choice but to hand them over. It was not a strong reign. But Nerva did one thing, very late in his life, that turned out to matter more than anything else any Roman emperor had done in nearly 100 years. He chose his successor not from his family, not from his bloodline. He had no son, and he made no effort to find one. Instead, he looked across the empire, found the most respected and most capable general of his generation, a man named Marcus Ulpius Traianus, who was at that moment commanding the legions on the Rhine frontier, and adopted him as his heir. Trajan, the man we now know simply as Trajan. When Nerva died, in January of the year 98, on a cold morning at the age of about 67, the empire passed peacefully to a man none of its previous rulers had ever met. There was no civil war. There was no purge of the Senate. The new emperor was, by all accounts, the most popular man Rome had produced in living memory. And he was not even, by birth, an Italian. Trajan was Spanish, the first Roman emperor born outside of Italy. The empire, you might say, had begun to belong to itself. Trajan ruled for almost 20 years. And during those 20 years, the Roman Empire grew larger than it had ever been before, and larger than it would ever be again. He was, by every account that survives, a soldier first and a politician second. He had grown up in army camps. He had served on the Rhine, in Syria, in Spain, in Germany. He preferred, even as emperor, to wear plain wool tunics, and to eat the same bread the legions ate. He walked through his army, on campaign, on foot, with the men. He learned their names, he drank their wine, he slept on hard ground next to them, when there was no good reason to. The Roman soldier of the year 100 would, if you had asked him, have died for Trajan, with no further thought, and many of them did. His first great war was in a place called Dacia, we would call it now Romania. A mountainous forested land north of the Danube, ruled by a king named Decebalus, who had been an embarrassment to Rome for 2 decades. Trajan invaded Dacia in the year 101, was driven back, returned in the year 105 with a larger army, and this time he ground his way slowly through the mountains, through the forests, through the long Dacian winter, until Decebalus, unwilling to be paraded in chains through the streets of Rome, cut his own throat in his own forest. The wealth that came back from Dacia was almost beyond imagining. The Dacian kings had been hoarding gold for centuries, and Trajan's army carried it all home. £500,000 of gold, by some accounts, £1 million of silver, 1,000 chariots, 100,000 slaves. The Roman economy for the next 10 years was simply rich. The treasury overflowed. Trajan paid for free games for the people of Rome that lasted, almost without break, for 123 days. He commissioned new roads, new aqueducts, a new harbor at Ostia. He built, in the heart of the city, an enormous new forum, with a market, a basilica, 2 libraries, and at the center of it all, a single tall column, carved from base to top, with a slow, spiraling relief of the Dacian War. That column still stands tonight, in Rome, exactly where Trajan put it. The gold is gone, the empire is gone, the column is still there. He fought one more great war, late in his life, this time in the east. Against Parthia, the old enemy. He marched through Armenia, took Mesopotamia, and reached, at last, the Persian Gulf. There is a story, possibly true, possibly invented, that he stood on the shore of the Gulf, and watched a merchant ship setting sail for India, and that he wept, because he was too old to follow it. He turned around, he began the long march home, and on the way, in the city of Selinus in southern Anatolia, he died. He was 63 years old. The year was 117. The empire, in that quiet moment, reached its largest size, 3.5 million square miles, 60 million people. From the misted hills of Britain, to the warm shore of the Persian Gulf, it is the high water mark. The flood reaches its peak. Now for the next 300 years, very slowly the water begins to recede. Trajan's successor was a man named Hadrian, and Hadrian had no interest in conquest. He had been Trajan's cousin, his ward, his favorite young officer. He had served on Trajan's campaigns, he had stood at Trajan's side. He understood, in a way perhaps no one else in Rome did, exactly what the conquests had cost. The treasure was real, the glory was real, but the empire in his eyes had stretched too far. The new provinces in Mesopotamia were already, even before Trajan's funeral, in revolt. The frontiers in Britain were exposed, the garrisons were thin. The empire was, like a man who has eaten too much at a long banquet, going to need a long, quiet evening to recover. Hadrian gave it that evening. He gave it nearly 21 years of evening. Within months of taking the throne, he abandoned Mesopotamia. He pulled the legions back across the Euphrates. He gave Armenia back to its kings. He stopped the Eastern War, paid off the Parthians, signed treaties, and turned his attention instead to the empire he already had. He spent more than half of his reign traveling, not as a conqueror, as an inspector, as a long, patient examiner of the world he had inherited. He visited Britain, where he ordered the construction of a long stone wall across the narrow neck of the island, from sea to sea, the wall that still bears his name, that you can still walk along on cold afternoons in Northumberland. He visited Gaul, and the Rhine, and the Danube. He visited Greece, where he was so enchanted by Athens that he stayed for 2 years, repairing temples, sponsoring festivals, learning the old philosophies. He visited Egypt, where his beloved companion Antinous drowned in the Nile in mysterious circumstances, and where Hadrian, in his grief, founded an entire new city in the boy's name. He visited Judea, where his policies, including a ban on circumcision and the founding of a Roman colony on the ruins of Jerusalem, provoked a final terrible Jewish revolt that he then, with great violence, put down. When he came home, at last, in his late 50s, sick, lonely, his beloved long since dead, he retired to a vast country villa at Tivoli, just outside of Rome. The villa is still there too. It is a ruin now, a sprawling complex of pools and gardens, and broken colonnades, the marble long since stripped, the roof long since fallen. You can walk through it on a quiet afternoon, and feel, even now, the sadness of the man who built it. He spent his last years there, writing poetry, listening to philosophers, sleeping badly. He had no children. He had to choose his successor. He chose, in the end, an obscure senator named Antoninus, on the condition that Antoninus in turn adopt and name as his own heirs 2 boys, a teenager named Marcus, who would become Marcus Aurelius, and a small child named Lucius. The chain of succession was now, by Hadrian's careful arrangement, set out 2 emperors deep. The empire, in his last act, was given a generation of stability that would hold, even after he was gone. Hadrian died in the year 138, on a hot summer morning, by the seaside at Baiae, with the warm wind coming in off the bay. He left behind a short, strange, very famous poem, addressed to his own departing soul. Animula vagula blandula. Little soul, wandering, gentle. Hosps comesque corporis. Guest and companion of my body. Quae nunc abibis in loca. Where now do you go? Pallidula. Rigida nudula. Pale, stiff, naked. Nec ut souls, dabis yokos. And no longer, as you used to, will you make any jokes. That was the Emperor of Rome, on his deathbed, talking to his own soul like a friend he was about to lose. And then came Antoninus Pius, the man we left, in the first chapter of tonight's story, in his garden, in the cool evening of the year 150. He ruled for 23 years. He almost never left Italy. He was, and this is the strange thing about Antoninus Pius, the thing that makes him unique among Roman emperors, almost without incident, there were no wars worth recording, no civil unrest worth crushing, no senatorial conspiracies, no purges, no exiles. The frontiers held, the harvests came in, the grain ships sailed, the taxes were collected. Year after year after year, in the long calm afternoon of the empire, Antoninus Pius sat in his garden, met with his advisors, signed his documents, and went to bed. He raised in his household the boy he had been instructed to raise, Marcus, the future Marcus Aurelius. He treated him, by all accounts, like a son. He taught him quietness. He taught him the Stoic philosophy that the boy would later become famous for. He taught him, above all, that the work of an emperor was not the work of conquest, or glory, or fame, but the work of patience, The slow work of holding a vast complicated thing together for one more day, and then one more, and then one more. When Antoninus died, also of natural causes, also peacefully, in the year 161, the watchword he gave his Praetorian Guard, on the evening of his last conscious day, was equanimitas. Equanimity, calm of soul. It is, perhaps, the most Roman word any Roman emperor ever spoke. He was 74 years old. The empire was, by every measure, wealthier than it had ever been, more peaceful than it had ever been, and more secure than it had ever been. The grain ships sailed. The fountains ran. The Pax Romana, that long Roman afternoon, had now lasted by some count almost 200 years. This is the moment, in our story, in which the long calm reaches its absolute peak. From this point forward, the curve, very slowly, begins to bend the other way. Marcus Aurelius is, of all the Roman emperors, the one we know best, because he wrote down what he was thinking. He kept a journal, a small notebook in Greek. He wrote in it at night, in his tent, on military campaigns, in the cold months on the Danube, far from the warm gardens of Rome. He never intended for anyone to read it. He never gave it a title. After he died, someone, we do not know who, collected the notebook, gave it the simple name, Ta Eis Houghton, Things to Himself, and the book has somehow survived for almost 1900 years. We now call it the Meditations. It is, in many ways, the most personal document any Roman ever produced. It is not history. It is not philosophy in the formal sense. It is the private, unfiltered, late-night thinking of a tired man, trying to remember why he is supposed to keep doing his job. You could leave life right now, he writes to himself. Let that determine what you do, and say, and think. And, a few pages later, the universe is change, life is opinion. And, a few pages after that, one of the most quoted lines he ever wrote, waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one. He inherited the empire from Antoninus Pius in the year 161, and almost immediately, the long calm began to break. The Parthians, in the east, invaded Armenia. The legions there were destroyed. Marcus sent his adoptive brother Lucius east to handle it. The war dragged on for 5 years. The Romans eventually won, took the Parthian capital, took an enormous amount of plunder, and sent the legions home. But the legions, on their march back, brought with them something they had not expected to bring, something they had picked up, possibly from a sacked temple in Mesopotamia, possibly from the contaminated water of an eastern campaign, possibly from one of the prisoners of war. A disease. We do not know, even now, what it was. Smallpox, probably, possibly measles, possibly something that no longer exists. But for the next 15 years, this disease, what we now call the Antonine plague, moved through the empire like a slow tide. It killed by some estimates 5 million people, by other estimates 10. It killed, in some cities, half the population. It killed 2 emperors, Lucius Verus, and, eventually, Marcus Aurelius himself. It killed soldiers. It killed senators. It killed slaves. It killed, in particular, the dense, packed cities of the empire, where the disease found the thickest fuel. This is the first crack. This is, in the long story we are telling tonight, the first quiet sound of something breaking. Because while the plague was spreading, the legions were also being called north. The Germanic tribes on the Danube, the Marcomanni, the Quadi, the Iazyges, names that are mostly forgotten now, but that meant a great deal then, had begun, for reasons we do not fully understand, to move. The frontier began to fail. Whole towns were sacked inside the empire. Marcus spent the last 15 years of his life almost entirely on that cold northern front, in his tent in the snow, trying to push back a movement of peoples that he did not in his lifetime fully understand. He died there, on the Danube, in the year 180. He was 58 years old. He had been emperor for 19 years. The plague was still spreading. The Germans were still moving. The work, as he wrote in his journal again and again, was not finished, and was not going to be finished, and was perhaps not the kind of work that ever could be. He left the empire to his son. His son was named Commodus, and it was, in the end, the worst decision Marcus Aurelius ever made. Of all the 5 good emperors, only Marcus Aurelius had a son. Only Marcus Aurelius could pass the empire down by blood, instead of by adoption. And so he did. It is one of the great, quiet tragedies of history that the man who wrote, again and again in his private notebook, "Do not be moved by the opinions of the crowd, do not chase glory, do not fear death," could not in the end see clearly what his own son was. Or perhaps he saw it, and could not bring himself to act. We will never know. Commodus was 19 when he took the throne. He had no interest in government. He had no interest in philosophy. He had no interest in the Danube War, which he ended within months of his accession, on terms more generous to the Germans than the Senate could quite believe. He returned to Rome, and he stayed there, and he gave himself over for the next 12 years, to the things he actually liked, which were primarily chariot racing, gladiatorial combat, and being praised by people who were paid to praise him. He fought in the arena himself, dressed as Hercules, against opponents who were not allowed to fight back. He renamed the months of the year after himself. He renamed the city of Rome after himself. He demanded to be worshipped as a living god. The Senate, terrified, complied. The provinces, far away, did their best to ignore him. He was, in the end, strangled to death in his own bath, on the last day of the year 192, by a wrestler named Narcissus, who had been hired by a small circle of senators and household staff, who could no longer bear to live in the same city as him. When the news reached the legions, in their cold camps on the frontiers, the world did not pause to mourn. The world instead looked around, and realized that there was no longer any orderly way to choose the next emperor. The 5 good emperors had ended. The system that had produced them, adoption of the most capable man, had been abandoned. There was no agreed successor. There was no clear procedure. There were only the legions, scattered across the empire, each loyal to a different general, each watching, in the cold winter of 193, to see what the others would do. What they did, in the months that followed, would change the empire forever. The next century, the 3rd century, would see 50 emperors come and go in 50 years. It would see civil war, plague, currency collapse, lost provinces. It would see the empire, very nearly, come apart. But all of that is for the next chapter of our story. For tonight, here, in this quiet moment, let us pause. The long afternoon is ending. The sun, low on the horizon, is about to slip behind the 7 hills. The grain ships are still sailing. The aqueducts are still running. The fountains in the forum are still pouring out their cold, clear water. But the wind is changing. There is, in the air over Rome, a smell that has not been there before. The smell of a fire, far away, that no one has yet quite noticed. Sleep well. We will continue, in a moment, with the long, hot, terrible 3rd century. When Commodus was strangled in his bath, on the last day of the year 192, the men who killed him had not given much thought to what would come next. They had a body in a quiet room in the imperial palace. They had the wrestler Narcissus washing his hands in the dark. They had a small, frightened circle of senators and chamberlains, looking at one another and at the body, and trying to decide what to say to the legions in the morning. The Senate, when it met, in the cold first hours of the new year, made a careful and respectable choice. They named, as the next emperor, a man named Pertinax. He was 66 years old. He was a former general, the son of a freed slave, calm in his manner, frugal in his habits, deeply respected. He took the throne. He began, almost immediately, to try to clean up the imperial finances, which Commodus had ruined. He cut the salaries of the Praetorian Guard. He cancelled their bonuses. 86 days later, the Praetorian Guard came to the palace, found Pertinax in his garden, and cut off his head. What happened next is a moment so strange and so revealing that it has been told and retold ever since. The Praetorian Guard, having killed Pertinax, did not yet know whom they wanted as the next emperor. So they did something that no army, in the long history of Rome, had ever done before. They put the empire up for auction. They stood in their barracks on the Caelian hill, and they let it be known, in the streets of Rome, that whoever could make the highest bid would be made emperor. The bidders were two. One was the prefect of the city, an experienced and respected man. The other was a wealthy senator named Didius Julianus, a man whose principal qualification was that he had a very large bag of gold. Didius Julianus offered the Praetorians 25,000 sestertii each. The prefect dropped out. The Praetorians, satisfied, opened their gates, and welcomed Didius Julianus inside, and acclaimed him as Emperor of Rome. He lasted 66 days. Because 3 different generals in 3 different parts of the empire, on hearing the news of the auction, decided that they were not, themselves, willing to accept an emperor chosen this way. Septimius Severus, on the Danube; Pescennius Niger, in Syria; Clodius Albinus, in Britain. Each one of them, on hearing the news, was acclaimed as emperor by his own legions. Each one of them began, immediately, to march toward Rome. Septimius Severus was the closest. He was, by far, the fastest. He arrived at the gates of Rome before the others were halfway there. The Senate, which had welcomed Didius Julianus only weeks before, now sentenced him to death. The Praetorian Guard, which had auctioned the empire, was disbanded. Septimius Severus marched into the city, was acclaimed emperor, and then turned his attention to the other 2 generals, who were still marching, still in the field, still claiming his throne. He defeated Pescennius Niger in Syria, in a battle near the city of Issus, on the same plain where Alexander the Great had defeated Darius half a thousand years before. He defeated Clodius Albinus in Gaul in a battle near Lyon, the largest battle that had ever been fought to that point between 2 Roman armies. By the year 197, 4 years after the murder of Commodus, the empire had a single emperor again, and he was Septimius Severus, and he was a soldier first and a politician second, and he understood, more clearly than any of the 5 good emperors had, that the empire now belonged, ultimately, to whoever the legions chose. There was no longer any pretense otherwise. His advice to his sons when he died 15 years later, in the cold reign of northern Britain, is one of the most famous lines any Roman emperor ever spoke: "Be at peace among yourselves, enrich the soldiers, and despise everything else." That, in 12 words, is the 2nd century becoming the 3rd. The Severan dynasty lasted 42 years. It produced 6 emperors. Most of them were murdered. The last of them, a young man named Severus Alexander, was killed in his tent, on the Rhine frontier, in the spring of the year 235, by mutinous soldiers, who did not, particularly, prefer anyone else, but who had decided, in a confused and angry moment, that they did not want him any longer. When his body was carried out of the tent, the Roman Empire entered a period that historians now call, simply, the crisis. It would last 50 years. In those 50 years, between the year 235 and the year 284, there would be, depending on how you count, somewhere between 20 and 50 emperors. Some of them ruled for years. Some for months. Some for only weeks. Most of them died violently. Some were killed by their own soldiers. Some by rival generals. Some by family members. Some very rarely by the enemy. Almost none of them died in their beds. The empire, in this period, did not so much fall as fragment. The frontiers, which it held for 2 centuries, began to fail in every direction at once. On the Rhine, Germanic tribes, the Franks, the Alemanni, crossed the river in raids that had once been small and now were large, that had once been turned back at the border and now penetrated, sometimes, hundreds of miles into Gaul. On the Danube, the Goths arrived, a new people from the north, and began to cross the river in great numbers, and to sack Roman cities that had not been sacked for generations. On the Euphrates, the Parthian Empire, the old enemy, was overthrown by a more vigorous Persian dynasty, the Sasanians, and the Sasanians began, almost immediately, a long campaign of raids and full-scale invasions that at one terrible moment in the year 260 would actually capture a Roman emperor, alive, on the field of battle, and carry him away. That emperor was named Valerian. He was the first Roman emperor ever taken prisoner. He died after some years in captivity, and the legend, possibly true, possibly invented, was that the Persian king used him on ceremonial occasions as a footstool to step on when mounting his horse. This was Rome, in the middle of the 3rd century. This was what the calm of Antoninus Pius had become. While the frontiers were failing, the inside of the empire was also coming apart. A second great plague, what we now call the Plague of Cyprian, named for the Bishop of Carthage who described it, moved across the empire in the years around 250. It was, by the descriptions that survive, even worse than the Antonine Plague had been. It killed, in some weeks, 5,000 people a day, in the city of Rome alone. It hollowed out the army, it hollowed out the cities, it killed, among many others, the Emperor Justinian, who lasted only a few months on the throne before the disease found him. The currency, in the same years, began to collapse. The Roman silver coin, the denarius, which for centuries had been almost pure silver, was now being debased, minted with less and less silver and more cheap copper, in order to pay the legions who had to be paid more and more to keep them loyal. By the year 270, the denarius was less than 5% silver. Prices across the empire began to spiral. A pound of grain that had cost a few coins in the year 200 cost, by some accounts, 100 times that by the year 270. Long-distance trade slowed. The roads, which had been famously safe, began to be unsafe. Travelers, who had once moved freely from one end of the empire to the other, began, again, to travel in armed groups, or not at all. And in the middle of all this, the plague, the inflation, the constant raids, the empire itself, the political fact of one Rome ruling from Britain to the Euphrates came apart. In the west, around the year 260, a Roman general in Gaul named Postumus rebelled, declared himself emperor of his own provinces, and founded what we now call the Gallic Empire. It included Gaul, Britain, and much of Spain. It had its own emperors, it had its own coinage, it had its own senate, more or less. It lasted for 14 years, and for those 14 years, the western quarter of the Roman world simply was not, in any practical sense, part of Rome. In the east, at almost the same moment, a different kind of empire was coming into being. In the desert city of Palmyra, halfway between Damascus and the Euphrates, a queen named Zenobia, the widow of a local Roman client king, began to expand her power outward. Within a few years she ruled Syria, much of Anatolia, all of Egypt. She also was, in practice, no longer part of Rome. She also issued her own coins. She also called herself, with some justification, an empress. By the year 270, the Roman Empire was, on the map, in 3 pieces. A Gallic Empire in the west, ruled from Trier, in what is now Germany. A Palmyrene Empire in the east, ruled from Palmyra, in what is now Syria. And in the middle, a battered, plague-stricken, currency-ruined Roman core, ruled from a Rome that was, for the first time in its history, beginning to build serious walls around itself, against the possibility that the barbarians might come, one day, that close. This is the lowest point. This is the moment, if there ever was one, when the Roman story might have ended, 300 years before it actually did. But it did not end. Not yet. Because in the same year that the empire was at its most fragmented, the year 270, a new emperor came to the throne in the central Roman core, in a place we now call Sirmium, in what is now Serbia. His name was Aurelian. He was, by birth, no one. He was the son of a tenant farmer. He had risen through the army, slowly, on no particular qualification, except an extraordinary capacity for making decisions, and surviving the decisions of others. He was about 60 years old when he took the throne. He had 5 years left to live. In those 5 years, he reunited the empire. He marched east first, he fought the Goths, he pushed them back across the Danube, then he turned south, he marched into Anatolia. He defeated Zenobia's army outside the city of Antioch. He took Palmyra, almost without a fight. He brought Zenobia, alive, in chains of gold, back to Rome, where she walked in his triumph and was, eventually, allowed to retire to a comfortable villa outside the city, where she lived out her days in a kind of polite, foreign quiet, until she died. Then Aurelian marched west. He defeated the last of the Gallic emperors, a man named Tetricus. He brought Tetricus also back to Rome, also in his triumph, and afterward made him, of all things, the governor of a province in southern Italy, where he too lived out a long and quiet retirement. By the year 274, Aurelian had, with his own hands and his own legions, put the empire back together. The Senate gave him a title. They called him Restitutor Orbis, the restorer of the world. He also began, in the same year, to build a new wall around the city of Rome, the Aurelian Wall. 12 miles long, 60 feet tall in places, 383 towers. It is, in some places, still there tonight. You can stand next to it. You can put your hand on it. It is the wall that admitted, in its very stones, that Rome was no longer safe, that barbarians could in fact come this close. The previous emperors of the calm century, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, had not, in their lifetimes, thought it necessary to build a wall around Rome. The city had not had walls, real walls, in 500 years. Now it did again. And it would, for the rest of its life. Aurelian was murdered, in the spring of the year 275, on the road to a new campaign in the east. He was killed by a small group of his own officers, who had been deceived by a clerk into thinking that the emperor planned to execute them. The clerk had forged a list. The officers panicked. They acted. By the time they realized the list was a lie, the restorer of the world was already dead. This is, perhaps, the most Roman thing about the 3rd century. Even when a great man arose, even when the work of 40 years was undone in a single bewildering campaign, even when the empire was, by sheer effort, glued back together, the system itself remained broken. Emperors still rose by the will of the legions. Emperors still fell by the panic of clerks. There was no orderly succession. There was no agreed procedure. There was only, again and again, the cold gleam of a blade in a tent, and the slow, troubled march of the next general toward Rome. After Aurelian there were several more emperors, in quick succession of varying quality. None of them were terrible, none of them were great. They held the empire together, more or less, for the next 9 years. And then, in the year 284, a soldier of obscure origin, the son of a freed slave from the Adriatic coast, was acclaimed emperor by his troops on the road back from a failed campaign in Persia. His name, at that moment, was Diocles. He would soon change it to a Latinized version, more imperial sounding. He would call himself Diocletian. He would rule, in some form, for 21 years. He would be the first Roman emperor in almost a century to die in his own bed, of natural causes, in a palace he had built for himself, growing cabbages in his garden. And he would, in his 21 years, change the empire so thoroughly that we now divide Roman history simply into before Diocletian and after. Everything we call in our histories the late empire, the bureaucracy, the absolute monarchy, the elaborate ceremonial, the 4 emperors instead of 1, the slow and inexorable separation of East from West, all of it begins with him. That is the next chapter of our story. The long, careful work of putting Rome back together, one piece at a time, by a man who understood, perhaps better than any emperor before him, exactly how broken it had become. For now, here, in this dark middle of the 3rd century, let us pause again. The plague is still in the cities. The frontiers are still bleeding. The coins are still bad. The walls of Rome are still going up. But the empire, against every reasonable expectation, is still standing. The grain ships, somehow, are still arriving. The aqueducts, somehow, are still flowing. And in a small palace on the Adriatic coast, an old soldier with a sharp face is beginning to think, slowly and carefully, about what to do next. Sleep well. We will continue, in a moment, with Diocletian, and the long quiet evening of the 3rd century becoming the 4th. To understand what Diocletian did, you have to first understand what he saw. He had grown up, like so many of the soldiers of the 3rd century, in a world that had never quite been calm. He was born around the year 245, in a small province on the Adriatic coast, in what is now Croatia. He was the son of a freed slave, or possibly of a clerk, or possibly of both. His family was poor. He had no education in the formal sense. He joined the army as a young man, the way poor and ambitious men of the provinces did, and he rose through the ranks the way they did, slowly, by competence and by luck. By the time he was about 40 years old, he was the commander of the bodyguard of an emperor who would not himself last very long. What he had seen, in all those years, was an empire that did not work. Not merely an empire in trouble, an empire whose basic mechanisms had broken. An empire where one man alone could not possibly govern from Britain to the Euphrates. Where one army, no matter how loyal, could not possibly defend frontiers that were thousands of miles apart. where one city, even the city of Rome itself, could not possibly remain the political center of a world this big and this dangerous. When the legions acclaimed him emperor, in the autumn of the year 284, he did not at first do anything very surprising. He killed the murderer of the previous emperor. He marched on the rival claimant. He won more or less easily in the spring of the next year, in a battle on the Margus River. He was now the sole emperor of Rome. And then he did something no Roman emperor had ever done before, voluntarily, in his life. He gave half the empire away. Within a year of becoming sole emperor, Diocletian appointed a colleague. The man's name was Maximian. He was an old comrade from the army, a soldier of the same generation, of the same background. Diocletian gave him the title of Augustus, the same title that Diocletian himself held. He gave him the western half of the empire to govern. He kept the east for himself. The two of them, going forward, would rule, in theory and in practice, as equals. 7 years later, in the spring of the year 293, Diocletian did it again. He appointed 2 more colleagues. They were called Caesars, a slightly junior title, just below Augustus. One was a man named Constantius, a tall, calm general from the Balkans. The other was a man named Galerius, fierce and difficult. Also from the Balkans, also from a poor rural background. Constantius would assist Maximian in the western Augustus's territory. Galerius would assist Diocletian in the east. The Roman Empire from that moment on had 4 emperors, 2 senior emperors, Augusti, 2 junior emperors, Caesars, each one of them with a defined territory, each one of them with his own court, his own army, his own seat of government. Diocletian based himself in Nicomedia, in what is now Turkey. Maximian based himself in Milan. Galerius based himself in Sirmium, in the Balkans. Constantius based himself, eventually, in Trier, on the cold northern Rhine. The arrangement is now called the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4. It was, perhaps, the most careful piece of political engineering any Roman emperor ever attempted. It would last in something like its original form for about 20 years. And then it would fall apart, more or less inevitably, in a great civil war. But for those 20 years, it worked. The frontiers were defended, the barbarians were pushed back, the internal rebellions were crushed. The empire, for the first time in 2 generations, had something resembling a government. But the Tetrarchy was only one of Diocletian's reforms, and not in some ways the most important one. He also rebuilt, almost from the ground up, the entire civilian administration of the empire. When he came to the throne, the Roman provinces were large, often the size of small modern countries. Each one was governed by a single official, who was usually also a military commander, and who therefore had in his hands both the law courts and the legions of his territory. This was, Diocletian had come to believe, exactly the wrong arrangement. It was the system that had produced, in the 3rd century, 50 rebel emperors. Every provincial governor was, structurally, also a potential pretender to the throne. So he split the provinces. He doubled their number, from about 50 to about 100. He grouped them into larger units called dioceses, which were ruled by officials called vicars, who reported in turn to 4 enormous regional units called prefectures, ruled by praetorian prefects. And more importantly than the sheer number, he split the powers. The new provincial governors had only civilian authority. They ran the law courts. They collected the taxes. They administered the cities. The military command in each region went to a separate official, called a dux, or later, a comes. The 2 officials were by design each other's check. Neither one of them alone had the resources to start a rebellion. This was a bureaucracy. A bureaucracy, in the modern sense of the word, is what the Roman Empire now had, for the first time in its history. The number of full-time imperial officials, before Diocletian, has been estimated at about a few hundred. After Diocletian, it numbered in the tens of thousands. Every provincial capital had its own offices. Every city had its registrars. Every village had its tax collectors. The empire, for the first time, was beginning to look not like an enormous, successful republic with an emperor on top, but like a state in the way we, today, would recognize the word. It was an astonishing administrative achievement. It was also, of course, an enormous tax burden. All those new officials had to be paid. The legions, also doubled in size, had to be paid. The new fortifications, the new roads, the new palaces of the four emperors, all had to be paid for. And the money, in the year 300, simply was not there. The Roman economy had not yet recovered from the 3rd century. The currency was still ruined. The grain trade was still slow. The merchants were still cautious. So Diocletian did the only thing he could think of. He raised the taxes. He instituted, for the first time in Roman history, a regular, predictable, empire-wide system of taxation. Every 5 years, every household in the empire was assessed. The land they owned, the labor they could perform, the animals they kept. All of it was registered, on long lists, in the offices of the new bureaucracy. And from those lists, every year, the imperial tax collectors knew exactly what to ask for. It was, again, an astonishing achievement. It also, in slow and quiet ways, transformed the empire. Because the new tax system depended on people staying where they had been registered. So Diocletian, gradually, began to bind people to their professions. A baker's son in the new system was expected to be a baker. A farmer's son, on a particular piece of land, was expected to remain on that land. The free movement of citizens, which had been one of the quiet glories of the early empire, began, very slowly, to harden into something else. A society of fixed roles. A society in which, for most people, the work you did was the work your parents had done, and the work your children would do. The historian who first noticed this change called it, sadly, the prelude to the medieval world. The slow turning of Rome into something that was not Rome. The third great reform of Diocletian was about the emperor himself. Augustus, the first emperor 300 years before, had been very careful to call himself, always, only the first citizen. Princeps. He had worn a senator's toga in public. He had walked more or less in the streets of Rome. He had been, in theory, only a magistrate among many. Diocletian put an end to all of that. He moved, permanently, out of Rome. The city, in his reign, was visited by the emperor exactly once. Otherwise, Diocletian governed from Nicomedia, far from the old capital, far from the Senate, far from the ancient ceremonies of the Roman people. He wore robes of silk and gold. He wore a diadem on his forehead. He demanded that those who came before him kneel and kiss the hem of his robe. He spoke, in public, only through chamberlains. He showed himself, only on great occasions, on a high throne, in deep shadow, in clouds of incense. He was, in his manner of rule, no longer the first citizen of a republic with an emperor on top. He was something closer to a Persian Shah. This is sometimes called, in our histories, the dominate, from the Latin word dominus, meaning master or lord. It is the new style of emperorship that Diocletian invented, and that all of his successors, more or less, retained. From this moment forward, the Roman emperor was not a magistrate. He was a sacred person. He was, increasingly, a thing to be worshipped. Which brings us, by a slow and uncomfortable path, to the last and darkest of Diocletian's reforms. In the spring of the year 303, Diocletian issued a series of edicts against a small religious community in the eastern provinces of the empire. The community was the Christians. By this point, 3 centuries after the death of the man at the center of their faith, the Christians had grown, quietly, into something the imperial government could no longer ignore. There were Christian communities in every major city of the empire. There were Christian senators. There were Christians, by some accounts, in the imperial palace itself. There were Christian priests, Christian bishops, Christian writings, Christian music, Christian burial places. They did not yet dominate Roman society, but they were no longer marginal. What the Christians refused to do, however, was sacrifice to the genius of the emperor. They would not burn the small pinch of incense on the small public altars, on the days when every other Roman did. They would not, on principle, offer worship to a man, even if that man was the master of the world. For Diocletian, this was not in the first place a religious problem, it was a political problem. The new style of emperorship that he had built, the silk robes, the diadem, the kneeling, depended absolutely on the idea that the emperor was a sacred person, owed something close to divine reverence by every subject. A class of citizens who flatly refused to give him that reverence was, in the structure of his new order, an intolerable thing. They would have to be made, somehow, to bend, or they would have to be removed. The edicts began with the destruction of churches. They escalated, quickly, to the burning of Christian books. They escalated further to the arrest, the torture, and the execution of Christian priests and bishops. They escalated in the eastern provinces to a general persecution of any Christian who would not perform the public sacrifice. It is now called, by historians, the Great Persecution. It was the largest and most systematic effort the Roman state had ever made to extirpate a religion. It lasted, in the East, almost 10 years. It killed, at minimum, several thousand people, and possibly tens of thousands. It produced, on the Christian side, a great wealth of stories. The stories of the martyrs, that would shape Christian self-understanding for the next 2,000 years. It also, in the end, completely failed. The Christians did not give up. They did not, as a body, sacrifice. They did not, as a body, even visibly shrink. Some of them, of course, did renounce their faith under torture, and many of these would later cause great difficulties for the Church when they tried to be readmitted. But the community as a whole survived. It went underground in some places. It thrived openly in others, where local governors lost the appetite for hunting their neighbors. By the time the persecution finally ended, around the year 312 or 13, the Christian Church was, if anything, larger and more visible than it had been when the edicts began. This is perhaps the great irony of Diocletian's life. He had spent 20 years rebuilding the Roman state, with an enormous and patient discipline, and he had, in many ways, succeeded. The empire, when he finished, was stronger than it had been in 100 years. The frontiers were quiet, the bureaucracy was running. The currency was, slowly, being repaired. He had even arranged in detail his own retirement. But the one community he had set out to destroy, with all the new powers of the new bureaucratic state at his command, had simply outlasted him, and within a generation of his death, it would inherit everything he had built. In the spring of the year 305, Diocletian did something else that no Roman emperor had ever done before. He retired. He stepped down voluntarily from the throne. He compelled his colleague Maximian in the west to do the same thing on the same day. The two senior Augusti went into private life. Their two Caesars, Galerius and Constantius, were promoted to Augusti in their place. 2 new Caesars were appointed under them. The whole machinery of the Tetrarchy, in theory, simply rotated forward. Diocletian himself retired to a vast palace he had been building, for years, on the Adriatic coast, near his birthplace, in what is now the Croatian city of Split. The palace is still there. Its outer walls form, today, the central old town of the city. People still live inside its rooms. They hang their laundry from its imperial window arches. You can walk, on a quiet morning, through what was once the emperor's bedroom, and buy a cup of coffee in what was once his audience hall. Diocletian lived there for 8 years, growing cabbages in his garden, reading philosophy, watching the Adriatic. There is a story, possibly true, that when his old colleague Maximian wrote to him, urging him to come out of retirement and reclaim the throne in a moment of crisis, Diocletian wrote back simply, that if Maximian could see how fine the cabbages in his garden were, he would never make such a request again. He died there, of natural causes, in the year 312. He was about 67 years old. The civil war that he had spent his life trying to prevent was, by then, fully underway, between the various sons and stepsons of his tetrarchs. The Tetrarchy itself, his great structural achievement, was crumbling, but the deeper reforms, the bureaucracy, the divided provinces, the new tax system, the new style of emperorship, all of those would survive him. All of those would shape the next 1,000 years of Roman history, in both halves of the empire. He had inherited from the 3rd century a Rome that had nearly ceased to function. He had handed on, to the 4th century, a Rome that worked. It was a different kind of Rome. It was harder, colder, more hierarchical, more bureaucratic. It was, perhaps, less beautiful than the Rome of Antoninus Pius. But it was, at least, alive. The next chapter of our story belongs to one of his Caesar's sons. A young officer, in his early 30s, with a heavy face, a quiet manner, and an enormous and quite specific ambition. His name was Constantine. And he was about to do something that would change not only Rome, but the history of the world, more profoundly than anything any emperor had ever done before him. For now, in this quiet evening at the end of the 3rd century, with the new bureaucracy running, and the old soldier emperor growing his cabbages by the sea, let us pause one more time. Sleep well. We will continue, in a moment, with Constantine, and the cross, and the long pivot of Rome from the world that ended to the world that was about to begin. When Diocletian retired, in the spring of the year 305, he had arranged with great care what was supposed to happen next. The 2 senior emperors, the Augusti, had stepped down on the same day, Diocletian himself in the east, Maximian very reluctantly in the west. The 2 junior Caesars had been promoted to take their places. 2 new Caesars had been appointed beneath them. The Tetrarchy was meant to roll forward, generation after generation, by orderly succession, forever. It lasted in this orderly form for about 18 months. By the autumn of the year 306, the system had already begun to break. In the cold city of York, in the far north of Britain, the Western Augustus, a calm and respected general named Constantius, lay dying. By his bed sat his eldest son. The son was at that moment nominally a hostage in the eastern court of Galerius, the senior Eastern Augustus. He had only recently slipped away from that court and ridden, fast and almost alone, across half of Europe to reach his father. His name was Constantine. When Constantius died, the troops in York did not, as Diocletian's plan required, look east for a new Caesar. They looked at the man at the bedside. They looked at the son, and they raised him on a shield in the cold July rain, and they acclaimed him as Augustus, on the spot, with no permission and no warning. He was about 33 years old. He had been, until that morning, no one in particular. He would now spend the next 18 years fighting, by every means he could find, to make the acclamation real. The civil wars that followed were long, complicated, and, in the end, won decisively by Constantine. He defeated his rivals one at a time. The first was a usurper in Italy, named Maxentius, the son of the old retired Maximian, who had taken Rome in a clever coup and held it for 6 years. Constantine marched on him in the autumn of the year 312. He crossed the Alps with a small but disciplined army. He defeated Maxentius in a series of engagements through northern and central Italy, and on the 28th of October of that year, just outside the walls of Rome, at a stone bridge across the Tiber called the Milvian Bridge, he won a final battle that would change everything. Maxentius drowned, in his armor falling from the bridge into the Tiber as his own troops broke and ran. Constantine, victorious, rode into Rome the next day. He was not yet the master of the empire. There were still rivals in the east, but he was, now, the unquestioned master of the west. The story that survives, about the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, is one of the most consequential stories in human history. We do not know if it is true. We do not know what really happened. What we have are two accounts, written by Christian authors who knew Constantine personally, claiming that on the afternoon before the battle, the new emperor, looking up at the sky, saw a vision. Some say it was a cross of light, hovering above the sun. Some say it was the Greek letters, chi and rho, the first letters of the name Christ, blazing in the air. And there were words, written below it, in Greek or Latin, depending on who is telling the story, in hoc signo vinces. By this sign you will conquer. Constantine, the story continues, ordered his men to paint the symbol on their shields that night. The next day, they won the battle. From that moment, the new master of the West began, slowly and unmistakably, to favor the Christian Church. We do not have to believe the vision to see what happened next. In the spring of the year 313, in the city of Milan, Constantine and his eastern colleague Licinius issued a joint document. It is now called the Edict of Milan. It declared, simply and without elaboration, that all religions in the Roman Empire were now legal. Christians could worship freely. They could not be persecuted. They could rebuild their burned churches. They could recover their confiscated properties. They were, in the eyes of the law, equal to every other religious community in the empire. This was not yet the establishment of Christianity. The old gods of Rome were not abolished. The pagan temples remained open. Most of the senators in Rome were still, on paper, pagan. Most of the legions, certainly, were still pagan in their day-to-day worship. But the great persecution was over, and the Christian Church, which only 10 years earlier had been outlawed under Diocletian, now found itself, suddenly, with an emperor who not only tolerated it, but seemed increasingly to favor it. Constantine took his time. He did not declare himself a Christian until much later in his life. He continued for years to mint coins with images of the old gods, especially Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. He continued to hold the title of Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the Roman state religion. He took, in his own person, no theological position, but he gave the Church, slowly and substantially, what it had never had before. He gave it land. He gave it tax exemptions. He gave it bishops who sat in his court. He gave it a hand in the law itself. Christian bishops were now, by his decree, allowed to act as judges in many ordinary disputes, simply by mutual agreement of the parties. And he did one other thing, in a quiet way, that would matter more than any of the rest. He convened, in the year 325, in a small Greek city in Anatolia called Nicaea, the first ecumenical council of the Christian Church. He invited, at imperial expense, more than 300 bishops from across the Mediterranean world. He housed them. He fed them. He sat among them in his purple robes, and he asked them, with the full weight of imperial authority behind the question, to settle finally what Christians actually believed. What they produced, after months of debate, was a single document, a creed, the Nicene Creed. It was the first systematic statement, agreed by the Church as a whole, of the faith that the Church proclaimed. It is still recited, almost every Sunday, in churches across the world tonight. This had never happened before. Religions, in the ancient world, did not have central authorities. Religions, in the ancient world, did not produce universal creeds. Religions, in the ancient world, were local, plural, contradictory, untidy. Christianity, after Nicaea, became something else. It became a single faith, with a single creed, with bishops who answered to councils, with councils that were called by emperors. It became, in other words, something that could be the official religion of a state. That was perhaps what Constantine had wanted all along. A single church, supporting a single emperor, in a single empire. He did not live to see it fully realized. But the machinery was in place. The other great act of Constantine's reign was geographical. He defeated, in the year 324, his last remaining rival, Licinius, in a series of campaigns across the Balkans and Anatolia. He was now, for the first time in nearly 40 years, the sole emperor of Rome. The tetrarchy was over. The empire had a single master again. But the master did not return to Rome. Constantine had, by this point, spent most of his adult life in the eastern provinces. He understood, more clearly than perhaps any of his predecessors, that the real wealth and the real population of the empire now lived in the east. The grain came from Egypt. The trade came through Syria. The fortified cities, the educated population, the new churches, all of it was east. The west was poorer, emptier, harder to defend, and increasingly peripheral. The capital, he believed, should be where the empire actually was. So in the year 324, the same year he defeated Licinius, he chose a site. It was a small Greek town on the European side of the Bosphorus, the narrow strait between the Aegean and the Black Sea. The town was already old. It had been founded by Greek colonists nearly 1,000 years before, and named for its founder, Byzas. It was called Byzantium. Constantine renamed it. He called it the New Rome. But everyone, almost from the first day, called it by another name. They called it Constantinople, the city of Constantine. He spent 6 years building it. He brought stone, statues and columns from across the empire. He built churches and palaces and a senate house. He built walls. He laid out a great Roman forum, with a porphyry column at its center, on which his own image stood, dressed as the god Apollo, with a halo of 7 sun rays around his head. The column is still there tonight, in the middle of modern Istanbul, blackened, broken, but standing. They call it the Burnt Pillar. On the 11th of May, in the year 330, Constantinople was consecrated. The Emperor of Rome no longer lived in Rome. He lived in a new capital in the east, beside the sea, looking out across the water toward Asia. Rome itself was, almost overnight, demoted. It still had its senate, it still had its prefect, it still had its great public buildings, and its enormous population. But it was no longer where the empire was governed from. The grain ships that arrived in Ostia each year began, slowly, to redirect themselves to the new capital. The taxes that had once flowed to Rome now flowed to Constantinople. The talented men of the eastern provinces no longer dreamed of going to Rome to make their careers. They went instead to the city by the Bosphorus, and they made their careers there. This is, perhaps, the moment in our story that mattered most. Not the cross at the Milvian Bridge, not the Edict of Milan, not even the Council of Nicaea. The moment that decided, in the long run, the future of the empire was the moment Constantine moved the capital east. Because from that moment there were, in practice, two empires. They still called themselves one. They still shared a single emperor sometimes. But the center of gravity had shifted, permanently and irrevocably, to the east. And in the long centuries to come, when the western half collapsed under invasion and decay, the eastern half, the half that lived in Constantinople, that prayed in Greek, that called itself Roman until the very end, would survive for another 1,000 years. Constantine himself died in the spring of the year 337, at his country palace outside the new capital. He was 65 years old. On his deathbed, finally, after a lifetime of careful neutrality, he was baptized as a Christian. The man who had brought the church out of the catacombs and into the imperial palace died inside its arms. He left the empire to his 3 sons. They would spend the rest of their lives killing each other. But the changes their father had made, the Christian capital, the Christian creed, the Christian emperor, those would outlast them all. The next century, after Constantine, is sometimes told as a story of decline. It is, in places, a story of decline. But it is also, in other places, a story of transformation, a story of a Roman world that was becoming, slowly and unmistakably, something different. Christian instead of pagan. Greek-speaking instead of Latin-speaking in its eastern half. Bureaucratic instead of senatorial. Urban instead of rural. Defensive instead of expansive. For now, here, in this quiet evening at the death of Constantine, with the new city by the Bosphorus still small and still raw, with the new church still arguing about its creeds, with the old empire still apparently strong on its frontiers, let us pause one more time. Sleep well. We will continue in a moment with the slow division of east from west, and the long, careful preparation of the Roman world for the storms that are coming. The sons of Constantine fought, more or less continuously, for the next 24 years. There were 3 of them: Constantine II, the eldest; Constans, the youngest; Constantius II, the middle son, and, in the end, the survivor. Their father had divided the empire among them on his deathbed. Each took a portion. Each, almost immediately, began to scheme against the others. By the year 350, 2 of the 3 were dead, killed in civil wars, and Constantius II was the sole emperor of Rome. He was a competent administrator, a poor general, and a deeply cautious Christian of a particular and now discredited theological persuasion. He believed, with the Arian party, that Jesus Christ was a created being, subordinate to God the Father, a position that the Council of Nicaea had specifically rejected, but which had remained in the eastern provinces, the dominant Christian view for several decades. Under Constantius, Arianism became for a generation the imperial religion. The Nicene bishops were exiled. The Nicene Creed was set aside. The Church very nearly broke in two. It did not, in the end, break. Constantius died in the year 361, on a campaign against his own younger cousin, who had just been acclaimed emperor by the Western legions. The cousin was named Julian. He was 30 years old. He was the last surviving male relative of Constantine. He was also secretly a pagan. Julian had been raised in the imperial household, surrounded by Christian tutors, in the Christian capital, but somewhere in his teenage years, in a remote estate in central Anatolia, where Constantius had sent him for safekeeping, he had begun, quietly, to read the old Greek philosophers. He had begun to admire them. He had begun, in some private corner of his mind, to believe in their gods. When he became emperor, he announced almost immediately his apostasy. He renounced Christianity. He returned, publicly, to the worship of the old Roman and Greek gods. He reopened the temples. He removed Christian privileges. He ordered the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem, partly to undermine Christian claims that its destruction was a sign of God's rejection of the Jewish people. He wrote in his own hand philosophical essays attacking the Christian faith. He is now called Julian the Apostate. He ruled for only 20 months. In the summer of the year 363, on a campaign in Persia, deep inside enemy territory, he was struck in the side by a spear. He bled to death in his tent that evening. His last words, according to a possibly invented but very popular Christian legend, were Vitisti, Galilei. You have won, Galilean. Whether or not he said it, the legend tells the larger truth. After Julian, no Roman emperor would ever again be a pagan. The pagan revival, which had seemed, for a moment, possible, simply ended. The empire would be Christian, from this point forward, with no real exceptions, until its final fall. The next several emperors, after Julian, were Christian generals of varying competence, fighting on increasingly difficult frontiers, and dying more often than not in battle. The most important of them for our story is the Emperor Theodosius I. He came to the throne in the year 379, in the eastern half of the empire, at a particularly difficult moment. The Goths, who had been pressing on the Danube frontier for some time, had recently won a catastrophic victory over the Romans, at a place called Adrianople, in what is now Turkey. The Eastern Emperor before Theodosius, a man named Valens, had been killed in that battle, along with 2/3 of his army. The Goths were now, for the first time, settled inside the empire, on Roman land, more or less by their own arrangement, and there was, for the moment, very little anyone in Rome could do about it. Theodosius made peace with them. He gave them land, he gave them grain. He let them keep their own kings and their own laws and their own religion, which was, by that point, a kind of Arian Christianity that had been spread to them, decades before, by a missionary named Ulfilas. They became, in theory, allies of Rome. In practice they became something new. A foreign people, living inside the empire, fighting for the empire when called upon, but not, in the deep sense, of the empire. This is the first of the great barbarian settlements. It will not be the last. Over the next century, Roman emperors will, again and again, make similar arrangements with similar peoples, sometimes from desperation, sometimes from cunning, always with the understanding that the empire is no longer strong enough to keep these peoples out, and so it must, somehow, find a way to absorb them. Theodosius did one other thing of historic importance. In the year 390, he issued a series of edicts that, for the first time, made Christianity not merely the favored religion of the empire, but the only legal religion. The pagan temples were ordered closed, pagan sacrifice was forbidden, on pain of death. The Olympic Games, which had been held every 4 years, in honor of Zeus, since the 8th century before Christ, were ended. The Vestal Virgins in Rome were dismissed. The sacred fire of Vesta, which had burned without interruption for 1,000 years, was extinguished. It is hard, even now, to take in what this meant. The old religion of Rome did not vanish overnight. Pagan philosophers continued to teach in Athens. Pagan priests, in remote villages, continued to perform their rites for centuries. But the great public expression of the old Roman religion, the religion that had built the city, the religion of the Forum and the temples and the auguries and the sacrifices, came to an end. Within a few generations, the only people who still remembered, with any precision, how to perform the old rites, would be a handful of antiquarians copying out fragments of older books. A world had ended, a new world had begun. When Theodosius died, in the spring of the year 395, at the age of 48, in his palace in Milan, he made one last administrative decision that would outlast every other thing he had done. He left the empire to his two sons. The elder son, Arcadius, 18 years old, would rule the eastern provinces from Constantinople. The younger, Honorius, 10 years old, would rule the western provinces from Milan. The arrangement was not in itself unusual. The empire had been ruled by multiple emperors before, the empire had been divided before. But this division, unlike the previous ones, would not be reversed. From this moment forward, the eastern and western halves of the Roman Empire would have separate governments, separate courts, separate armies, separate financial systems, and increasingly, separate cultures. They would still call themselves Roman, they would still consider themselves, in some technical legal sense, two halves of one empire. But they would not, again, be ruled by a single emperor. The dividing line, drawn by Theodosius on his deathbed, runs roughly through the Western Balkans. To the west of it, the future is Latin, Catholic, increasingly rural, increasingly poor, increasingly fragile. To the east of it, the future is Greek, Orthodox, urban, wealthy, defensible. The two halves, from this moment forward, are walking different roads. The western half, the half centered on Rome, has, perhaps, 80 years left. The eastern half, the half centered on Constantinople, has more than 1,000. Theodosius is the last emperor in our story to rule both halves at once. He is, in this very particular sense, the last of the truly Roman emperors. After him, the histories of the East and the West diverge so completely that it becomes increasingly strange to call them, even, two halves of the same thing. For now, in this quiet evening, with the old emperor dying in his palace and his two young sons receiving the news in their separate courts hundreds of miles apart, let us pause one more time. Sleep well. We will continue, in a moment, with the western half, and with the long approach of the storms that will, in time, bring it down. The boy emperor of the West, Honorius, was 10 years old when his father died. He grew up to be, by every account that survives, one of the least competent rulers in the long history of Rome. He was timid. He was incurious. He lived for almost his entire reign in the marshy fortress of Ravenna, on the Adriatic coast of Italy, surrounded by a court of eunuchs, far from the city of Rome, and farther still from any actual battlefield. He raised, as one of his great hobbies, prize chickens. He gave them names. The most famous of them was called Roma. It is not, perhaps, fair to blame Honorius alone for what happened next. The system he inherited was already failing. The army was already too small. The frontiers were already too thin. The treasury was already too empty. He inherited a situation that no one perhaps could have rescued. But it is not unfair to note that he did almost nothing in his 30 years on the throne to try. The first great blow fell in the autumn of the year 406. On the last night of the year, December the 31st, traditionally, though the precise date is uncertain, the Rhine froze. The Rhine, the great river that had marked the northern frontier of the Roman world for 400 years, simply froze across, deep and hard enough to walk on. And on the far bank of it, that night, there were waiting an enormous coalition of Germanic peoples. The Vandals, originally from the cold lands south of the Baltic. The Suebi, from somewhere in central Germany. The Alans, an Iranian-speaking people who had been pushed westward by some catastrophe in the steppe. Together, they had been gathering on the frontier for months. They were not in any single sense an army. They were a migration. Men, women, children, wagons, cattle, dogs. Possibly 200,000 people, all told. They had come because they could no longer stay where they had been. The Huns, behind them, had been driving everyone west. When the Rhine froze, they walked across. There was no Roman force in any meaningful sense to stop them. The legions on the Rhine had been thinned, again and again over the previous century, to fight in other places. The civilian population on the Roman side of the river was unprepared. The peoples who crossed that night spread out, in small bands, across northern Gaul, taking what they wanted, killing those who resisted, settling, when they grew tired, in places that they liked. By the spring of the year 407, almost all of Roman Gaul was, in some practical sense, no longer Roman. The cities still had their walls. The bishops still held their offices. The Latin language was still spoken, but the imperial government no longer ruled the countryside. The taxes no longer arrived. The roads were no longer safe. Britain, isolated by the chaos in Gaul, gave up on the empire entirely and declared its own emperor, who declared himself, in turn, the legitimate emperor of the West, and crossed back into Gaul with his legions to try to make the claim real. He was eventually defeated. But by the time the chaos settled, in the year 410, Britain was simply no longer part of the Roman Empire. The legions had been withdrawn. The imperial government had given up. The local Romanized aristocracy was on its own. Britain has, from this moment, no Roman emperor. It has instead a cold twilight period of 3 or 4 centuries, that we now call the Dark Ages, during which the Latin language is gradually replaced by a Germanic dialect from the Anglo-Saxon settlers. The urban Roman civilization gradually decays back into a rural one, and the historical record becomes so thin that we no longer know, with any confidence, almost anything that happened. That is what the breaking of the Rhine cost. In a single generation, an entire province of the Roman Empire, wealthy, urban, literate Britain, simply went dark. The second great blow fell almost simultaneously, but in a different direction. The Visigoths, the same Goths that Theodosius had settled inside the empire a generation earlier, had been growing increasingly restless. They had a new king, a young, ambitious man named Alaric. He had served for years in the Roman army. He had fought for Rome. He had been promised, at various points, command of the Roman legions in the Balkans. The promise had been, again and again, broken. He had also been promised, by various Roman officials, regular payments in gold for his people. Those payments had also, again and again, fallen behind. In the year 408, Alaric ran out of patience. He marched his people across the Alps, through the passes of what is now northern Italy, and he laid siege to the city of Rome itself. It was the first siege of Rome in 800 years. The Senate, in panic, sent out negotiators. Alaric demanded a payment. The Senate paid. Alaric withdrew. The negotiations continued, off and on, for 2 more years. The Senate kept asking the imperial court at Ravenna for help. The imperial court, which is to say Honorius and his eunuchs and his prize chickens, kept refusing to send any. They were safe in Ravenna. The Senate could fend for itself. By the summer of the year 410, Alaric had had enough. He marched on Rome again. This time, no payment would do. On the night of the 24th of August, the Salarian Gate of Rome was opened by someone. We still do not know who, though most of the surviving accounts blame slaves who had decided that this was their moment, and the Visigoths walked in. For 3 days, they sacked the city. It was, by the standards of ancient sacks, a relatively gentle one. Alaric's troops were Christian. They respected the great basilicas. They did not burn the city. Most of the famous ancient buildings survived. But the houses of the senators were looted. The gold of Rome, what was left of it, was carried out in carts. The political shock was beyond measuring. The city of Rome had not been sacked since the Gauls, 800 years before. It was unthinkable. Across the Mediterranean world, when the news arrived, people stopped what they were doing. Roma capta est. Rome has been taken. In a small monastery in Bethlehem, a Christian scholar named Jerome, then in his late 60s, working on his great translation of the Bible into Latin, sat down to write a letter. He wrote, in shock, "In one city, the whole world has perished." He could not, he said, stop weeping. Across the Mediterranean, in the city of Hippo, in what is now Algeria, another Christian scholar, the Bishop Augustine, began to write, slowly and patiently, the most important book of his life. He called it De Civitate Dei, the City of God. It was a book about how the eternal city, the city of God, the city of the Spirit, was not the same thing as the earthly city, the city of Rome. It was a book about how, even when the earthly city fell, the eternal city remained. It was, in some quiet way, a book about how a Roman could begin, finally, to imagine a world without Rome. That book became, in the centuries that followed, one of the most influential books in the history of Christianity. It is still read tonight. It still teaches what it taught Augustine's grieving readers 1600 years ago. That cities fall, that empires die, that the deeper things go on. Alaric himself died of disease only a few months after the sack of Rome, somewhere in southern Italy. His body, the legend says, was buried in the bed of a small river called the Busento, which his men temporarily diverted to dig the grave, and then let flow back over it. The legend says they killed the slaves who had done the digging, so that no one would ever know exactly where the king of the Goths was buried. His successor was named Atulf. Atulf married Galla Placidia, the half-sister of Honorius, who had been taken in the sack as a hostage. He led his people out of Italy, into Gaul, and eventually into Spain, where they settled, by treaty, into what would become, over the next several generations, the Visigothic kingdom. It would last, in southern France and Spain, for 300 years. It would have its own kings, its own laws, its own coinage. It would never, again, formally be part of the Roman Empire. The Vandals, meanwhile, who had crossed the frozen Rhine 4 years before the sack of Rome, kept moving. They moved through Gaul, into Spain, and then, in the year 429, under their king Genseric, they crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and entered North Africa. This was a catastrophic blow. North Africa, especially the rich grain-producing province around Carthage, was one of the great wealth centers of the Western Empire. It fed Rome. It provided enormous tax revenues. The Vandals, in 10 years of campaigning, took all of it. By the year 439, Carthage was the capital of a Vandal kingdom. The grain ships that had once sailed for Rome now sailed, when they sailed at all, for the Vandals. In the year 455, the Vandals, by then masters of the western Mediterranean, sailed across to Italy and sacked Rome themselves. It was a far worse sack than the Visigothic one. Genseric's troops were less restrained. The plundering went on for 2 weeks. The roof tiles of the Temple of Jupiter, gilded with bronze, were stripped off and shipped back to Carthage. The Empress Eudoxia, the widow of the previous emperor, was carried away with her 2 daughters as a hostage. The word Vandal exists in our language today, 1600 years later, because of those 2 weeks. By the middle of the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was, in any practical sense, no longer a state. It was a collection of barbarian kingdoms, loosely surrounding a vestigial Roman court that still claimed, in name, to govern the whole. The Visigoths held southern Gaul and Spain. The Vandals held North Africa. The Burgundians held the Rhone Valley. The Franks were settling, in growing numbers, in northern Gaul. The Anglo-Saxons were settling in Britain. The Suebi held part of Spain. The Alemanni held the Rhine. What remained under the direct rule of the Western Emperor was Italy, and not all of Italy, and only sometimes. The Roman Empire, in the West, was now smaller than the kingdoms that had grown up around it. It survived for another 20 years, mostly because nobody had yet bothered to formally declare it over. That declaration was coming. But before it came, one more storm would arrive, from the eastern steppes, in the form of a man whose name has lasted, in the European imagination, longer than almost any other from this century. A man whose horde came so close to taking Italy itself, in the spring of the year 452, that the Pope of Rome rode out personally to meet him on the banks of a small Italian river, and beg him, face to face, to turn back. His name was Attila. The story of his rise, his terror, and his strange sudden ending is the next chapter of our story. For now, in this dark middle of the 5th century, with the city of Rome twice sacked, with North Africa lost, with the legions disappearing into local levies, with the Western Empire shrinking slowly into the borders of Italy itself, let us pause one more time. Sleep well. We will continue in a moment with the Hun. The Huns came out of the east. They had been moving for at least 100 years slowly westward across the great open grasslands of Central Asia. We do not know precisely where they started. Some scholars now think they may have been related to the Xiongnu, a people who had pressed against the northern frontier of China for centuries before vanishing from the Chinese histories around the 2nd century. Others doubt the connection. What we know, with some confidence, is that they were a steppe people. They lived on horseback. Their wealth was their flocks. Their cities were their wagons. They could shoot a bow at full gallop, in any direction, with terrifying accuracy. And by the second half of the 4th century, they had pushed all the way to the Black Sea, and beyond it, into the Roman world. It was the Huns, more than anything else, who set the great migrations of the late 4th and early 5th centuries in motion. The Goths, the Vandals, the Burgundians, the Alans, all of them moved west, in part because the Huns were behind them. The peoples who broke the Rhine in 406 did not break it because they wanted Roman land. They broke it because they could no longer live where they had been living. The Huns had taken it. For most of the 5th century, the Huns themselves had been settled more or less on the great plains of Hungary and the lower Danube. They had a series of kings. They had a kind of court. They demanded, and received, large annual payments in gold from the Eastern Roman Emperor, in exchange for not raiding the Balkans. The arrangement was, in its strange way, stable. That stability ended in the early 440s with the rise of a new king. He was the son of the previous king, sharing power at first with his brother. Then his brother died, suddenly, and possibly not by accident. He took the kingship for himself. His name was Attila. Attila ruled the Hun Confederation for about 20 years. In those 20 years, he built the most feared military force the late ancient world had ever seen. He extracted from the Eastern Roman Emperor payments that grew larger and larger until the Eastern treasury was, for some years, almost entirely going to him. He destroyed Roman cities in the Balkans. He massacred Roman armies. He earned, in the surviving Roman accounts, a name that has lasted ever since: Flagellum Dei, the scourge of God. What he was actually like as a man is harder to know. We have a single eyewitness description, written by a Greek diplomat named Priscus, who visited Attila's court in the year 449. Priscus was struck, he wrote, by how plain it all was. The other Hun nobles ate from gold and silver plates. Attila ate from a wooden one. They drank from gold and silver cups. He drank from wood. His clothing was simple. His house was made of wood. He sat at his table, eating his plain food, in his plain clothes, while around him his nobles roared, and his bards sang. He was short. He was dark. He had, Priscus wrote, a flat nose and small eyes. He spoke quietly. He smiled rarely. He was, by every account, an extraordinarily intelligent man, a brilliant politician, and a man whose personal restraint was, in a court of vast looted wealth, a kind of statement. In the year 451, Attila turned west. He had been threatened, in a strange episode, by a letter from the sister of the Western Emperor, a woman named Honoria, who was being kept under a kind of polite house arrest after a scandal involving a chamberlain. She had sent Attila her ring, with what could be interpreted, very generously, as a marriage proposal. Attila chose to interpret it that way. He demanded of the Western Emperor half of the Western Empire as a dowry. When the Western Emperor refused, he had his pretext: he marched. He crossed the Rhine in the early spring of 451, with an army that may have been 500,000 strong, including not only the core Hun cavalry, but also Goths, Gepids, Burgundians, and many other peoples who had been folded into the Hun Confederation. He swept through northern Gaul, sacking cities, burning churches, slaughtering populations. He was met, finally, by a Roman army. The army was commanded by the last great Roman general of the Western Empire, a man named Aetius, who had himself spent several years as a young hostage at the Hun court, and who knew Attila personally. Aetius had cobbled together a coalition of Roman legions: Visigoths, under their king Theodoric, Burgundians, Alans, Saxons, and Franks. He intercepted Attila on a wide flat plain, somewhere in northern France or southern Belgium, at a place we now call the Catalonian Plains. The battle that followed, on a hot summer day in the year 451, was one of the largest pitched battles in all of late antiquity. The casualties, by some accounts, ran into the hundreds of thousands. The Visigothic king Theodoric was killed in the cavalry charge. The Hun army was, for the first time, stopped. Attila, by nightfall, was forced to retreat behind a barricade of wagons. Aetius, having won, did not press the attack. He let Attila go. He believed, we are told, that a destroyed Hun confederation would only allow the Visigoths, his uneasy allies, to grow too strong. He preferred to balance the two. Attila, having lost, did not give up. He invaded again the following year, in the spring of 452. This time, he came south, into Italy itself. He took the city of Aquileia, on the Adriatic coast, and destroyed it so completely that its surviving inhabitants fled, in their fishing boats, to the safe islands of a nearby lagoon, where they founded, slowly, a new city. They called it Venice. He moved south, sacking, burning, taking. He approached Rome. What happened next is, again, a story we can tell only in fragments. We know that the Pope of Rome, an old, calm, wise bishop named Leo, rode out from Rome with a small embassy to meet Attila on the banks of a river in northern Italy, possibly the Mincio. We know that they spoke. We know that Attila the next day turned around and went home. We do not know precisely what they said. The legend, which grew up later in the church, was that Leo had come bearing the apostles Peter and Paul beside him in spirit, and that Attila, looking up, had seen them, and had been afraid, and had agreed to leave Italy alone. The more practical historians point out that Attila's army was, by that summer, suffering from disease and famine, that the Romans had paid him a large additional sum in gold, that the Eastern Emperor had begun raiding the Hun homeland in the Balkans, and that he had every practical reason to leave. Whatever the reason, he left. He returned to his capital, on the great Hungarian plain. There, in the spring of the year 453, he married, for the last time, a young woman named Ildiko. The wedding feast was, by all accounts, enormous. Attila drank, late into the night, a great deal of wine. When he was carried, asleep, to his bedchamber, he was alone with his new bride. The next morning, when his attendants came to wake him, they found him dead. He had suffered, in his sleep, a massive nasal hemorrhage, drowned, very likely, in his own blood. His sons, of whom there were several, fought one another for the succession. They lost, in a series of small battles over the next several years, control of the various peoples who had made up the Hun Confederation. The Goths, the Gepids, the others, all rebelled, all broke away, all set up kingdoms of their own. By the year 470, the Hun Empire that had so terrified the Roman world was, simply, gone. It had lasted in its full power for less than 30 years. The Huns themselves, as a distinct people, also gradually disappeared. Some of them retreated east, back across the Black Sea. Some of them merged into other Germanic groups. By the 7th century, no one in Europe could find a Hun anymore. They had passed through the Roman world like a great storm. They had broken much. And then, like a storm, they had moved on. The death of Attila ought in some neat narrative to have saved the Western Empire. It did not. The general Aetius, who had defeated Attila on the Catalonian plains, was murdered the following year by his own emperor, in a fit of paranoid jealousy. The emperor who had murdered him was, in turn, murdered 6 months later by Aetius's friends. The Western imperial throne, after that, passed through the hands of a series of short-lived figures, most of them puppets of the German generals, who actually held the army. For the next 20 years, between the year 455 and the year 476, the Western Roman Empire produced, in rapid succession, 8 or 9 emperors depending on how you count. Some lasted a year, some lasted only weeks. None of them controlled in any practical sense more than a small part of Italy. The empire, as a political reality, had ceased to exist. What was left was the appearance of an empire, behind which the actual power was held, almost entirely, by the Germanic generals who commanded what was left of the army. The end, when it came so quietly that almost no one at the time recognized it as an end at all. That is the next chapter of our story. The very small, very quiet day, in the autumn of the year 476, when the last emperor of the West, a child, named Romulus Augustulus, gave up his crown and walked into history. For now, in this evening at the end of Attila's life, with the Hun Empire dissolving on the eastern horizon, and the Western Roman Empire dissolving on the western one, let us pause one more time. Sleep well. We will continue, in a moment, with the last Roman emperor of the West. The boy who would be the last emperor of the Roman West was named, in one of the strangest accidents of history, Romulus. This was not a chosen name taken to evoke the founder of Rome. This was the boy's actual birth name. His father, Orestes, had been the secretary to Attila the Hun in the days of Attila's court, and had returned to Italy after Attila's death to make his career as a general in what was left of the Roman army. Orestes had named his son after his own father, who had, in turn, been named after the founder of the city. The coincidence is so perfect that it sometimes seems invented, but it was not invented. The last emperor of Rome was, by the gentlest accident of family naming, also the namesake of its first king. He was about 12 years old when his father, in the autumn of the year 475, deposed the previous Roman emperor and placed his small son on the throne in his place. He was given, as a gesture of imperial dignity, the cognomen Augustus, after the first emperor. But the Roman court, perhaps cruelly, perhaps fondly, perhaps both, did not call him Augustus. They diminutized it. They called him Augustulus. Little Augustus, the little emperor. He had been on the throne for 10 months when his story ended. The man who ended it was named Odoacer. He was a German, in the broad sense. His exact people are debated by historians. Some sources call him Assyrian, some a Hun, some Erugian. What is clear is that he was a soldier. He had risen through the German auxiliaries of the Roman army. By the year 476, he was the commander of the federated German troops in Italy. His troops had a demand. They wanted as their pay what they had long been promised: Roman land. They wanted to be settled, formally, on the great estates of Italy, with rights to 1/3 of the produce. The general Orestes, the father of the little emperor, had refused. Odoacer had taken the side of the troops. In a brief, decisive series of engagements, Odoacer defeated Orestes, captured him, and had him executed at Piacenza in late August of the year 476. The little emperor, in his palace at Ravenna, was now alone. Odoacer marched on Ravenna. He took it without a fight. He brought the little emperor before him. We are told that Odoacer, on seeing the boy, was moved. Romulus Augustulus was, by every account, a beautiful child, gentle, frightened, well-spoken. Odoacer did not kill him. He did not even imprison him in the ordinary sense. He sent the boy, with a generous pension, to live with his relatives in a comfortable villa in Campania, in southern Italy. We do not know exactly when Romulus Augustulus died. The pension was still being paid in his name. Several decades later, he may have lived to be an old man. He may have lived through, in his quiet southern villa, the entire reign of the next Italian king, and watched, from a distance, as the world he had nominally ruled simply continued, under different management, without him. What Odoacer did, in the autumn of the year 476, was something that no one had ever quite done before. He did not declare himself emperor. He did not raise another puppet to the throne. He did instead something that on its surface looked almost humble. He took the imperial regalia of the West, the diadem, the purple robe, the scepter, and he packed them into a chest. He sent the chest, with a polite letter, to the Eastern Emperor, in Constantinople, a man named Zeno. The letter explained that the West no longer required an emperor of its own. There was already, the letter said, a perfectly good emperor in Constantinople. He could continue to be the emperor of the entire Roman world, just as the emperors of old had been. The administration of Italy in his name would be handled by Odoacer, who would be content with the more modest title of king. Of Italy, more or less. Of the army, certainly. Zeno, in Constantinople, did not quite know what to do with this. He was a cautious man, and he had problems of his own. He sent a polite reply that recognized neither Odoacer nor a competing claim from the deposed previous Western emperor, and he settled instead for a kind of vague legal fiction in which the Roman Empire continued to exist, in theory with one emperor in the East, and a kind of viceroy of unclear title in the West. This is the moment in the older histories that has been called the fall of Rome. It is a strange moment to call a fall. No one died. No city was sacked. No major battle was fought. A boy, in a palace, gave up a crown. A general, with a polite letter, sent the regalia east. The rituals of the Senate continued in Rome. The Latin language continued to be spoken. The Catholic Church continued to operate. The wine still arrived in the markets. Most people, in most parts of what had been the Western Roman Empire, would not have known, that autumn, that anything in particular had happened. The taxes would still be collected, by someone. The roads would still be patrolled, by someone. The shape of the day-to-day world had not, for most people, changed. But something had ended. The political fact of a Roman emperor of the West, governing in Latin, from an Italian capital, over the lands from Britain to North Africa, had simply ceased. It would not return. The years that followed have a quiet, unsettled quality. Odoacer ruled Italy in his uneasy half-recognition for 13 years. He was a competent, careful king. The Senate of Rome continued to meet. The Latin liturgy continued to be celebrated in the great basilicas. The aqueducts of Rome were repaired. The grain was distributed. The population, slowly, was learning to live in a world without an emperor. In the year 488, the Eastern Emperor Zeno, who had grown weary of the situation in Italy, made a careful arrangement with another barbarian king. The king's name was Theodoric. He was an Ostrogoth, an Eastern Goth, a relative of those Visigoths who had sacked Rome 2 generations before. He had grown up, like Aetius before him, as a hostage at the imperial court in Constantinople, where he had learned Greek, learned philosophy, learned how to read and write. He was, in every meaningful sense, a Romanized German prince. Zeno gave him a commission: take Italy from Odoacer, rule it in my name, settle your people there. Be done with the problem. Theodoric did exactly that. He marched into Italy with his entire people, perhaps 100,000 Goths, men, women, children, and he fought a series of battles against Odoacer that lasted 4 years. In the end, in the spring of the year 493, after a long siege of Ravenna, the two kings agreed to a peace. They would rule Italy jointly. Theodoric invited Odoacer to a banquet to celebrate. At the banquet, Theodoric drew his sword and killed Odoacer himself. He buried him quickly. He massacred his family. He took Italy as his own. He would rule it, alone, for the next 33 years. Theodoric's reign in Italy was, by the standards of the late 5th century, a kind of golden age. He kept the Roman bureaucracy, he kept the Senate, he kept the Roman law, he spoke Latin, he read Roman literature. His chief minister was a Roman senator, a philosopher named Cassiodorus, who corresponded with bishops and emperors in elegant Latin prose. His other great minister was another Roman senator, a philosopher named Boethius, whose book The Consolation of Philosophy, written later in prison while awaiting execution by Theodoric himself in a fit of paranoia, would become one of the most influential works of medieval Christian philosophy. Theodoric was, in his way, an enlightened ruler. He repaired the walls of Rome, he restored the public buildings of Ravenna. He settled his Goths on Italian land without, in most cases, displacing the Roman owners. The Goths and the Romans lived, in his reign, side by side. The Goths farmed and fought. The Romans wrote, taught, judged. Each kept their own laws, their own religion, the Goths Arian Christian, the Romans Catholic, and their own language. It was an experiment in coexistence that almost worked. It almost worked. But not quite. Theodoric in his old age became suspicious of his Roman ministers. He had Boethius arrested, on weak evidence, and quietly executed in a Pavia jail. He had Boethius's father-in-law, Symmachus, also a senator, also a philosopher, also executed shortly after. The Roman aristocracy, which had been, for 30 years his trusted partner, turned, slowly, against him. He died in the year 526, of natural causes, in his palace in Ravenna. He was buried in a great mausoleum just outside the city, a domed building of cut stone, with a single enormous granite slab as its roof, which is still there tonight. You can walk around it, on a quiet morning. The bones of Theodoric were removed long ago, by some later Christian emperor who could not bear to leave an Arian heretic resting in such a tomb. But the building remains. It is one of the strangest, most beautiful, most quietly sad of all late Roman buildings. After his death, the great experiment in Gothic Roman coexistence in Italy began, almost immediately, to come apart. His grandson, who succeeded him, was a child. The regency was unstable. The Roman aristocracy looked east, toward Constantinople, where a new emperor had just come to the throne. He was an ambitious man. He believed with all his heart that the Roman Empire was one thing, and that he was its rightful master. He believed that Italy in particular ought to belong to him. His name was Justinian. The next chapter of our story belongs to him. For now, in this quiet evening at the death of Theodoric, with the great mausoleum still bright on its hill outside Ravenna, with the Western world quietly tilting, again, toward the east, let us pause one more time. Sleep well. We will continue in a moment with Justinian and the long, brilliant, doomed Reconquest. The man who became, in the year 527, the Eastern Roman Emperor, was the son of a peasant farmer from a small village in what is now North Macedonia. His given name, in his rural childhood, was Petrus. He had been brought to Constantinople as a teenager by his uncle, an old soldier named Justin, who had risen, against every reasonable expectation, through the ranks of the imperial guard. Justin became, in old age, an almost accidental emperor, chosen by his fellow guardsmen, in a confused succession crisis, when no one with a stronger claim could be agreed on. He was already in his 60s, illiterate, in poor health. His nephew, the young Petrus, who had taken the more imperial-sounding name Justinian, did most of the actual work of governing during his uncle's 9-year reign. When Justin died, in the late summer of 527, Justinian inherited the throne. He was about 45 years old. He had spent most of his adult life in the imperial palace, in study, in administration, in a kind of quiet, patient apprenticeship. He was not by nature a soldier. He was a lawyer, a theologian, a builder, an organizer. And he believed, more deeply than any emperor had believed for many generations, that the Roman Empire was still, in its essence, a single thing. That its temporary fragmentation was an abnormality. That the Western provinces, lost a generation before, ought to be brought back. That he personally was the man to do it. He would spend the next 38 years trying. His tools in this great project were three. The first was a general. His name was Belisarius. He was, perhaps, the most gifted Roman commander since Aurelian, 2.5 centuries before. He was about 30 when Justinian came to the throne, a quiet, careful, deeply professional officer who had risen through the ranks of the Eastern Field Army. He had a particular talent for fighting outnumbered, with small, disciplined forces, against larger and clumsier enemies. He had a particular gift for siege warfare. He had also, the historians tell us, an unshakable personal loyalty to Justinian, of a kind that the late Roman world had almost stopped producing. The second tool was a wife. Her name was Theodora. She had grown up, the daughter of a bearkeeper in the Hippodrome, in the rougher quarters of Constantinople. She had been, in her youth, an actress, which in the Roman world was a profession that overlapped uncomfortably with prostitution. She had traveled, lived hard, returned to the capital, and met the future emperor while he was still a junior official. He had married her, against considerable opposition. He had then changed the law, by imperial decree, to make such a marriage legally possible. She was, by every account that survives, the most intelligent and forceful woman in the Roman world of her time. She advised Justinian on every major decision. She intervened, more than once, in moments of crisis, with a steadiness that her husband himself sometimes lacked. In the famous Nika riots of the year 532, a 6-day uprising in Constantinople that nearly toppled the regime, Justinian was preparing to flee the city when Theodora stopped him. She is reported to have said, in an address to his council, "Royal purple makes a fine shroud." He stayed. The revolt was crushed. The reign continued. The third tool was money. The Eastern Empire, unlike the Western, had survived the 3rd and 4th centuries, with its tax base more or less intact. Egypt still produced grain. Syria still produced trade. Anatolia still produced soldiers. Justinian had, when he began his reconquest, the largest treasury any Roman emperor had commanded in 200 years. He would, in the course of the reconquest, spend almost all of it. The reconquest began in the year 533, with North Africa. The Vandal kingdom, which had taken Carthage a century earlier, was by this point in disarray. Its kings had quarreled. Its army had grown soft on the wealth of the African provinces. Justinian sent Belisarius, with a small army of perhaps 15,000 men, across the Mediterranean. The campaign lasted 9 months. The Vandal kingdom, which had stood for 100 years, simply collapsed. Belisarius entered Carthage in triumph. The treasure of the Vandals, including by some accounts, the gold and silver vessels that the Vandals had themselves looted from Rome a century before, and which had originally been looted from Jerusalem by the Romans 5 centuries before that, was loaded onto ships and brought back to Constantinople. Africa was a Roman province again. The grain ships of Carthage, after 100 years of feeding Vandals, began to sail east to feed Constantinople. The next campaign was Italy. It would not be so easy. Belisarius landed in Sicily in 535. He took the island in months. He crossed to the mainland. He took Naples. He took Rome. He took, eventually, Ravenna itself. The Ostrogothic king Vataces was sent, in chains, to Constantinople. The campaign seemed, by the year 540, to have succeeded. Then it began to come apart. A new Gothic king arose, a young, ferocious commander named Attila. He retook the Italian countryside. He retook the cities. He retook Rome itself in 546 and held it for several years. He did not destroy it. He spared its people. He sent embassies to Constantinople asking for peace. Justinian refused. The campaign in Italy lasted, in the end, almost 20 years. By the time it ended, in the year 554, with the final defeat and death of Attila and his successor, Italy was in ruins. The cities had been besieged, sometimes 3 or 4 times. The countryside had been fought over for 2 decades. The Roman aristocracy that Theodoric had cultivated had been almost entirely killed off, or had fled. The agricultural population had been decimated, partly by warfare, partly by famine, partly by something else. Because in the middle of the Italian campaign in the spring of the year 541, a new disease had arrived in the eastern Mediterranean. It came, the sources say, on grain ships from Egypt. It reached the port of Pelusium first. It moved up the coast, to Alexandria. It crossed to Constantinople by the early summer of 542. From there, it moved, with terrifying speed, through the entire Mediterranean world. It is now called the Plague of Justinian. It was, almost certainly, the same disease that would, 800 years later, become known in Europe as the Black Death. We now call the bacterium Yersinia pestis. The Romans called it nothing in particular. They simply called it the death. It killed, in Constantinople, perhaps 1/3 of the population, in a single year. It killed, in many smaller cities of the Eastern Empire, more. It killed Belisarius's wife. It killed thousands of soldiers. It killed Justinian himself for a few weeks. He caught the disease in 542, was given up for dead, and then recovered. He was one of the few who did. Across the Mediterranean world, in the years between 541 and 550, somewhere between 20 and 40 million people died. The exact number cannot be known. What can be known is that, when the plague finally subsided, the late Roman world had been transformed. The cities were emptier. The fields were unworked. The taxes did not arrive. The army could not be recruited at the old levels. The Eastern Empire that emerged from the plague was, in every measurable sense, smaller and poorer than the one that had entered it. And the great project of reconquest which Justinian had been pursuing for 15 years was, suddenly, beyond the means of a state that no longer had the population to support it. Justinian himself lived on, growing older, growing frailer, in his palace in Constantinople. He continued until the end to issue edicts. He continued to commission churches, including the great Hagia Sophia, the most beautiful church the late ancient world ever built, which was finished in 537 and is still standing tonight in modern Istanbul, 16 centuries later. He completed in those long years his other great project, which had nothing to do with the army. He commissioned and oversaw the codification of Roman law. The result was a series of books, the Codex, the Digest, the Institutes, that gathered, organized and reduced to a manageable form the entire body of Roman legal thinking that had accumulated over 1,000 years. The Corpus Juris Civilis, as it is now known, would survive everything else Justinian did. It would be rediscovered in northern Italy in the 11th century. It would form the basis of European legal education for the next 800 years. The civil law systems of most of continental Europe today still ultimately descend from it. So does, by indirect routes, much of the law of Latin America, of Quebec, of Louisiana. Of all the things Justinian built, this is the one that has lasted longest. Not the conquests, which began to come apart almost as soon as he died. Not the great church, which was eventually converted to other uses. The book of law, the careful organization of inheritance, contract, marriage, theft, debt. The dry technical work of a lawyer emperor in his late middle age, going over the rules of a society that he believed, with his whole heart, was eternal. He died in the late autumn of 565, in his sleep, in the imperial bedroom. He was 83 years old. The rumor, in the imperial court, was that the Empress Theodora had visited him, in his last weeks. She had been dead for 17 years. The Italian Reconquest, that he had spent 20 years and most of his treasury achieving, lasted 3 more years. In the spring of the year 568, a new Germanic people came down through the Alpine passes into northern Italy. They were called the Lombards. They had been, until then, a kind of Roman ally on the upper Danube. They had decided, for reasons we do not fully understand, to leave that frontier and walk into Italy. They found, when they arrived, an Italy that was almost defenseless. The wars of Justinian had drained the Italian garrison. The plague had drained everything else. The Lombards moved south, slowly and methodically, taking city after city. By the year 572, they held most of northern Italy, the Po Valley, the central Apennines. Only certain coastal cities, and certain heavily fortified Adriatic strongpoints, remained in Eastern Roman hands. The Eastern Empire would, from this point on, never again hold most of Italy. The peninsula would instead become a patchwork: a Lombard kingdom in the north, a Lombard duchy in the center, a corridor of Byzantine territory along the coasts, and a small, strange, increasingly powerful figure in the city of Rome itself, who was no longer an emperor, or even, in any practical sense, an imperial governor. He was the bishop, the pope. The popes, from this point forward, would be the closest thing the West had to a continuing Roman authority. They would govern Rome. They would defend it. They would in time claim, in the absence of an emperor, a kind of civilizational role that the Church had never claimed before. But that is properly the beginning of medieval European history. It is no longer properly Roman history at all. For the Roman Empire of our story, what remained after Justinian's death and the Lombard invasion of Italy, was the eastern half. The empire centered on Constantinople, the empire that spoke Greek and prayed in the Orthodox liturgy and called itself Roman to the very end. That empire would survive for another 900 years. That long, strange, brilliant survival is the last chapter of our story tonight. For now, in this quiet evening at the end of Justinian's reign, with the Hagia Sophia rising bright over the Bosphorus and the Lombards camping in the Po Valley, let us pause one more time. Sleep well. We will continue, in a moment, with the Long Twilight of Byzantium. We have been, for some hours now, walking westward, through the long collapse of the Roman world we knew. Through Trajan's frontier and Hadrian's wall, through the calm afternoon of Antoninus Pius, through the 3rd century crisis, through Diocletian and Constantine, through the sack of Rome and the silence of the Western Empire, through Justinian's brilliant and ruinous attempt to put it all back together. Now very quietly, we turn east. Because there was, in the year of Justinian's death, in 565, still a Roman emperor on a Roman throne, in a Roman capital. He sat in Constantinople, on the European side of the Bosphorus, in a great palace beside the Hagia Sophia. He spoke a kind of late Greek that he, and everyone around him, called Roman. He minted coins inscribed in Latin, with the legend Roma. He believed himself, as every emperor of his line would believe for the next 9 centuries, to be the legitimate, lawful, and continuous successor of Augustus, who had founded the imperial system 600 years before, and of Romulus, who had founded the city itself 8 centuries before that. He was Roman, his empire was Roman. The fact that the city of Rome itself was, at this moment, in the hands of barbarians, did not, in his eyes, change this in any essential way. The empire was not a city. The empire was a continuity. The continuity ran, unbroken, through him. We now call this empire the Byzantine Empire, after the old Greek name of its capital, but this is a name invented by historians, almost 1,000 years after the fact, in the 16th century. The Byzantines themselves never used it. They called themselves, until the very end, Romaioi, Romans. The next 900 years of Byzantine history are, if we wished, a long story all of their own. Tonight, we have to tell them, by necessity, in very compressed form. We are taking the long view from a great distance, the way you might watch a candle burn down across a long winter evening, watching the wax pool slowly, watching the flame, again and again, gather itself and continue. In the 7th century, only a generation after Justinian, the empire faced a catastrophe almost as great as the 3rd century had been. A new religion arose in the Arabian Peninsula, founded by a merchant of the city of Mecca named Muhammad, who taught a strict, austere, monotheistic faith. After his death, in the year 632, his followers swept out of Arabia with a speed that astonished everyone who saw them. Within 10 years, they had taken Syria, Egypt, and most of the eastern Roman Mediterranean. Within 30 years they had taken North Africa. The wealthy provinces that had supported Justinian's Reconquest, that had grown grain for Constantinople for centuries, were simply gone. They have not until tonight been Roman again. The Byzantine Empire, after this loss, was a much smaller thing. It held, essentially, Anatolia, the Balkans, and a few coastal possessions in southern Italy and Sicily. It had lost, in a single generation, more than half its territory and most of its wealth. It nearly fell, several times. The Arab armies besieged Constantinople itself in the year 674, and again in 717, and were turned back, both times, by a strange weapon that the Byzantines had developed, and which they called Greek fire, a kind of inflammable liquid, possibly petroleum-based, that could be sprayed from siphons onto enemy ships, and would burn even on water. The walls of Constantinople, the legend went, could not be taken. They had been built, 600 years before, by Theodosius II. They were 3 lines of stone, each higher than the last, separated by deep moats. They were 40 feet high in places. They had towers every 50 meters. The Arabs, for all their successes elsewhere, could not breach them. The Byzantines behind those walls survived. For the next 4 centuries, between roughly 700 and 1100, the Byzantine Empire lived as a kind of medieval state, smaller than the empire of Justinian, but stable, organized, defended. It produced great soldier emperors. It produced great theologians. It produced an extraordinary tradition of religious art. The icons, the mosaics, the great churches in Greek towns, and Anatolian villages. In the middle of the period, between the years 726 and 843, it was convulsed by an internal religious crisis we now call the iconoclastic controversy, a long argument, sometimes violent, about whether religious images were a legitimate aid to worship or a form of idolatry. The argument was settled in the end, in favor of images. The result was the great flowering of medieval Byzantine icon painting, which is one of the most beautiful artistic traditions any society has ever produced. In the 10th century, under a series of vigorous emperors of the Macedonian dynasty, the empire actually expanded. It pushed the Arabs back, it retook Crete, it pushed into northern Syria. It Christianized the Slavic peoples to its north, including the Bulgars, the Serbs, and, most importantly, the Russians. It was the Byzantine missionaries Cyril and Methodius, in the 9th century, who designed an alphabet for the Slavic languages, the alphabet we now call Cyrillic, and who brought the Byzantine liturgy, the Byzantine chant, the Byzantine spirituality, into the cold great forests of Eastern Europe. The Russian Orthodox Church, the Serbian Orthodox Church, the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, all of them tonight, are in some real sense daughters of Byzantium. The eastern half of the Roman world did not, when it became Christian, become Latin, it became Greek. And the Greek Christian world, over centuries, became the Eastern Orthodox world, which is still, tonight, the religion of perhaps 250 million people, from the cold cities of Russia to the white islands of the Aegean. Then, in the 11th century, the long-protected core of the empire, Anatolia, fell. A new people had arisen in the steppelands of Central Asia. They were Turkic-speaking, originally pagan, then Muslim. They moved west, the way many steppe peoples had moved west before, and in the year 1071, they fought a great battle against the Byzantine Emperor Romanos IV, at a place called Manzikert, in eastern Anatolia. The Byzantines lost, the emperor was captured, the army was destroyed. Within a generation, almost all of Anatolia, the great heartland that had fed Constantinople for 7 centuries, was in the hands of the Seljuk Turks. The empire survived, but it was now permanently weakened. It was now a small thing, mostly a Balkan state, with a long vulnerable border along the Aegean. In its desperation, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I sent an appeal, west, across the religious gap that had been growing between the Greek East and the Latin West for centuries. He wrote to the Pope of Rome. He asked for soldiers. The Pope, Urban II, agreed. He preached, in the year 1095, a great sermon at Clermont in France, calling on the knights of Latin Europe to march east, to free the Holy Land from the Muslims, and along the way, to help the Byzantines. The Crusades had begun. The First Crusade, against every reasonable expectation, succeeded. Latin knights took Jerusalem in the summer of 1099. They established small crusader kingdoms along the Levantine coast. The Byzantines, taking advantage of the crusader pressure, retook some of Anatolia. But over the next 2 centuries, the relationship between the Latin Crusaders and the Greek Byzantines, who had not really wanted them in the first place, deteriorated badly. They differed in religion. The Great Schism of 1054 had formally separated the two churches. They differed in language. They differed in temperament. They came, increasingly, to mistrust one another. The mistrust, at last, became disaster. In the year 1204, the soldiers of the Fourth Crusade, on their way to attack Egypt, were diverted, by a tangle of debt and political maneuvering, into attacking Constantinople itself. They breached the walls, the same walls that had held off the Arabs for 400 years. They sacked the city, they burned its libraries, they stole its relics. They melted down its bronzes for coin. They installed, in the place of the Byzantine emperor, a Latin emperor of their own choice. The Byzantine state, founded by Constantine almost 900 years before, was, briefly, ended. The Greek refugees, who had escaped the sack, regrouped in 3 small kingdoms in exile. at Nicaea in Anatolia, at Trebizond on the Black Sea coast, at Epirus in northwestern Greece. They waited. They organized. In the year 1261, the Nicaean ruler Michael VIII Palaiologos retook Constantinople from the Latins. The Byzantine Empire was restored. But it was, now, a much smaller and much poorer thing. It would never again be a great power. Its population was a fraction of what it had been. Its treasury was empty. Its army was a few thousand mercenaries. The Italian merchant cities of Venice and Genoa now controlled most of its trade and most of its profits. It survived, in the way that an old man survives, by making no sudden moves. The end was a long time coming. For the next 200 years after the Latin sack, the Byzantine Empire shrank and contracted. The Ottoman Turks, who had risen in northwestern Anatolia in the late 13th century, slowly took the Byzantine Anatolian heartland. They crossed into Europe. They took the Balkans. By the year 1400, the Byzantine Empire consisted, essentially, of the city of Constantinople and a small surrounding territory, plus a few outposts in southern Greece. The Ottomans were patient. They did not take the city all at once. They could see, from year to year, that the empire was no longer dangerous. They concentrated on consolidating their other territories. They built a new capital, at Adrianople, just a few days' march from Constantinople. They surrounded the city, by stages, on every side. The Byzantines in their last decades sent embassies west, asking for help. They offered, in some of these embassies, to reunite the Greek and Latin churches, on Latin terms, in exchange for a crusade to save Constantinople. The reunion was negotiated several times at councils. It was rejected every time by the Byzantine population, who would, in the end, rather be ruled by Muslim Turks than by Latin Catholics. There is a famous saying from this period, attributed to a Byzantine official named Lucas Notarus: "Better the Sultan's turban than the Pope's tiara." The crusade did not come. The help did not come. The city by the spring of the year 1453 stood almost alone. The final siege began on the 6th of April. The Ottoman Sultan was Mehmed II, 21 years old, brilliant, ambitious, ruthlessly determined to take what every Ottoman before him had failed to take. He brought with him the largest army any Ottoman had ever fielded. Perhaps 80,000 men, plus a great fleet, plus, most importantly, an enormous new piece of artillery cast for him by a Hungarian engineer named Orban. The cannon, called the Basilica, was 27 feet long, fired stone balls weighing 600 pounds, and could be reloaded only 3 times a day. It was the largest gun, by some accounts, that had ever been built. It could break, with patience, the walls of Theodosius. The defenders inside the city numbered perhaps 7,000, of whom maybe 2,000 were professional soldiers. The emperor was Constantine XI, named in the strange way of late Byzantine namings, after the founder of the city. He was about 48 years old. He was not by temperament a great commander, but he was a brave man, and he understood that he was the last emperor of Rome. The siege lasted 53 days. The cannon, day after day, ground at the walls. Sections of wall fell. The defenders rebuilt them in the night. The Ottomans tried to mine under the walls. The defenders countermined and killed the miners. The Ottomans launched by night on the harbor. A fleet of small ships dragged overland to bypass the great chain that closed the Golden Horn. The defenders saw them coming and held the harbor. But there were too few of them. The walls were too long, the cannon was too patient. On the night of the 28th of May, in the year 1453, the Emperor Constantine attended a final liturgy in the Hagia Sophia. The Greek and Latin clergy, who had been quarreling for centuries, served together. The choir sang, the candles burned, the emperor took communion. He returned, in the dark, to the walls. At about 2 o'clock in the morning, on the 29th of May, the final assault began. The Ottomans came in 3 waves. The first 2 were broken on the walls. The third, of elite janissaries, found a small gate that had been accidentally left unbarred. They poured through. The walls, breached at last, were quickly overrun. The defenders fell back into the city, fighting from street to street. The Emperor, Constantine XI, stripped off his imperial purple, drew his sword, and ran into the thickest part of the fighting. He was never seen alive again. His body was never identified. Some accounts say he was killed in the breach. Some say he was killed in the streets. Some say he simply disappeared. The legend, which is still told tonight in the Greek-speaking villages, is that he was turned to marble by an angel, and lies, sleeping, somewhere beneath the city, waiting to return when Constantinople is Greek again. The city fell. By midday the Ottoman troops had reached the Hagia Sophia. They turned it, with great speed, into a mosque. The Sultan rode in, on a white horse. He stood in the great central nave, looked up at the dome, and is said to have wept. The Roman Empire had ended. After 1500 years. It is the 29th of May, in the year 1453. It is a Tuesday. Greek-speaking Christians, even tonight, 16 centuries after these events, will not, by tradition, undertake any major business on a Tuesday. The day, in their old folk memory, is unlucky. The day the city fell. That, in the strict and final sense, is the fall of Rome. Not the sack of Rome by the Visigoths in 410, not the deposition of Romulus Augustulus in 476, not the collapse of the Tetrarchy or the death of Justinian, or any of the other moments that the textbooks sometimes circle. The fall of Rome, taken seriously, is the fall of the city that called itself Roman until the last hour, on a Tuesday morning in May, 1500 years after the city of Romulus had been founded. It had taken, by that count, almost 1,000 years longer to die than the textbooks usually admit. It had been declining, almost the entire time by some measure. It had been thought finished, again and again, only to revive. It had been, by turns, Latin and Greek, pagan and Christian, Eastern and Western, expanding and contracting. It had been, in the end, simply old. For now, here in this last evening of our long story, with the Sultan's banners over the great church, and the body of the last emperor lost in the rubble, let us pause one more time, before we close. Sleep well. We will return, in a moment, to where we began. We have come, at last, to the end of our story. It has been a long walk. We began, almost 5 hours ago, in a quiet garden in the year 150, at the height of the Pax Romana, with an old emperor finishing his evening meal. We have followed, since then, the long, slow, patient unwinding of his world. The plague that arrived under Marcus Aurelius. The crisis of the 3rd century. The reorganization under Diocletian. The conversion under Constantine. The slow division of East from West. The sack of Rome. The arrival of Attila. The deposition of the last Western emperor. The brief, ruinous reconquest of Justinian. The long, brilliant survival of Byzantium. The walls of Constantinople holding. The walls of Constantinople finally breaking. It is, depending on how you count, either 300 years of story, or 1300. It is one of the longest dyings any human society has ever undergone. And it is, in the end, a story that has no neat ending. Because the things Rome made did not, themselves, die when the city fell. The Latin language, which Rome had carried into every Western province, did not vanish. It softened, slowly, generation by generation, into the languages we now call Romance. The Latin spoken in Roman Gaul became, in time, French. The Latin of Roman Iberia became Spanish, Portuguese, Catalan, Galician. The Latin of Italy itself splintered into Italian, and the dozen dialects of the peninsula, the Latin of Roman Dacia, became Romanian. Roman Latin, even after Rome had fallen, kept being spoken, every day, by hundreds of millions of people. It is still being spoken tonight, by you perhaps, or by someone you love. The Roman law, codified by Justinian in his old age, did not vanish. It was rediscovered in northern Italy in the 11th century. It was studied at Bologna. It became the foundation of the legal education of all of medieval Europe. The civil law systems of France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Portugal, all of Latin America, Quebec, Louisiana, much of the Middle East, all of them descend in some real way from the work of Roman lawyers in late antique Constantinople. When you sign a contract tonight, when you inherit a piece of property, when you marry, when you divorce, much of the conceptual machinery you are using is Roman. The Roman religion, in its Christian form, did not vanish. The Catholic Church kept the Roman administrative pattern, the Latin liturgical language, the Roman calendar, the Roman ceremonial robes, the Roman hierarchical structure of dioceses and provinces. The Pope of Rome, on the throne tonight, is the direct, continuous, lawful successor of an office that goes back to the Christian community of Imperial Rome. The Eastern Orthodox churches, in the same way, are the direct, continuous, lawful successors of the Christianity of Constantinople. There are, between them, more than 1 billion Christians on earth tonight, and almost every one of them is, in some real sense, the spiritual descendant of late Roman religion. The Roman political vocabulary did not vanish. The word Senate, the word Republic, the word Empire, the word Consul, the word Dictator, the word Tribune, the word Magistrate, the word Forum, the word Constitution, the word Citizen. All of them are Latin. All of them, in their modern meanings, are Roman. The republics of the modern world, when they meet in their senate houses, when they elect their consuls, when they speak of their constitutions, are using, almost word for word,